Islam didn't come to Iran in 1979. It became Shia in 1501 and fell to the Caliphate almost 1,000 years prior. This is the story of what came before. In a cave in northern Afghanistan, archaeologists found a small limestone pebble. On it, carved by an unknown hand around 15,000 years ago, is a human face. No one remembers who carved it, but this tiny pebble is one of the oldest portraits in all of Asia. 100,000 years ago, people already knew the broken ridges of the Zagros and the bare deserts around the future cities of Herat and Kabul. In western Iran, caves and rock shelters in the central Zagros, places like Bisitun, Wawasi, and many others, preserve stone tools from the lower and middle Paleolithic, made by Neanderthals and early modern humans who hunted wild goats in steep valleys and stalked deer along oak woodlands. Farther east, in what would become Afghanistan, other bands followed rivers that now barely trickle through gravel beds. In the north, in Badakhshan and Balkh, stone tools tell the same story of long cold hunts and temporary camps. As the climate slowly shifted and the last ice age loosened its grip, some of these hunters found a shallow rock shelter at Karakamah. Archaeologists would one day uncover an Upper Paleolithic blade industry, perhaps 30,000 years old, fine blades struck from carefully prepared cores, and above those, a later Mesolithic layer with tiny microliths. Not far away, in another rock shelter at Akukupruk, a different kind of object lay buried beneath thousands of stone flakes. Someone, near the end of the last ice age, picked up a small limestone pebble and incised a human face onto it. Radiocarbon dates from the associated layers put this tiny portrait among the oldest pieces of portable figurative art known in Asia. We don't know the artist's name, nor their intention, but the carved pebble tells us that by the end of the Paleolithic, people here were symbolizing and perhaps telling stories about ancestors or spirits. When the ice sheets shrank and the post-glacial world settled into a warmer rhythm, wild grasses thickened in the valleys and herds of goats and sheep found reliable grazing. Human groups followed them year after year. On the western edge of our region, in the high Zagros of Iran, people at Ganjdara and Ali Kosh began to do something new. Around 10,000 years ago, they were managing herds of goats, shifting slowly from hunting to herding. They sowed gathered grains, emmer wheat and barley. Across the central Iranian plateau, the same slow transformation unfolded. At Tepesialk, near modern Kashan, the earliest levels reveal pottery, buff wares painted with dark geometric designs, simple but well made. Houses, at first rudimentary, become more substantial, and the first experiments with copper smelting appear. Over the next 2 millennia, these Neolithic villages stretched, multiplied, and tied themselves together with trade. But by the 5th millennium, potters in many parts of Iran and Afghanistan were producing thin-walled, well-fired vessels, a whole menagerie painted in black or red on pale clay. The painted wares of Tepe-Hisar in northeastern Iran and of Mundigak in Afghanistan are among the finest. We still have no stories, no names or speeches, until one corner of the region takes a different path. In the lowlands of Khuzestan, at Susa, villages kept growing and soon became a regional centre. The lowlands made it possible for early farming settlements to grow larger and more specialised, as irrigation agriculture supported dense populations. By the late 4th millennium BCE, a shockwave of cultural change spread across much of the Near East, from the Sumerian city of Uruk. The Uruk expansion spread the world's first urban system, cities, bureaucracy, and long-distance economic control. In Susiana and at centres like Susa, these tools of management transformed society. Around 3200 BCE, scribes in Susa began to scratch signs into wet clay. adapting the new, still awkward proto-cuneiform system that had just appeared in nearby Sumer, developing a local Proto-Elamite script. With this writing comes history. Susa grew to exert its own influence over the lowlands under its native rulers, known as Elamites, and became a political entity called Elam. A rival, sometimes an ally, but always a threat. In the old Elamite period, Elamite rulers of the Awan and later dynasties appear in treaties and war reports. One Awan king concluded a treaty with Naram-Sin from the line of Sargon of Akkad, but after regaining power in Mesopotamia, the Neo-Sumerians captured Susa and the surrounding regions. A new line of Elamite kings, the Shemashki dynasty, was rising in the highlands. As the Sumerians weakened, the rising highland power of Shemashki, together with Elamites in Susiana, helped not only end Ur's control of Susa, but brought down the Neo-Sumerian Empire itself around 2004, carrying the last Sumerian king away in chains. With Susa back in their hands, the Elamites entered a golden age under the Sukalma dynasty, or Great Regents, the third and final phase of Old Elam. They were influential in Mesopotamian affairs for over a century, before Hammurabi and his coalition of allies expels them. But they would remain a regional power for centuries more. Elamite merchants moved along mountain passes into the interior, carrying Mesopotamian textiles and metalwork eastward, and bringing back copper, tin, stone, and a particular blue gemstone that no city in Mesopotamia could do without. Lapis lazuli came from high mountains far to the northeast, from Badakhshan in what is now Afghanistan. To get there from Susa, traders had to cross the Iranian plateau. Clay tablets in the Proto-Elamite script have turned up at Tepe Yahya in southeastern Iran, and at Sialk itself, written tallies to keep track of goods. If we only follow cities, we miss one of the most persistent forces in this region, the politics of the mountains. Among these Bronze Age groups are highland peoples often labelled by outsiders, with names like Lulubi and Gutians. The mountains repeatedly generated military pressure and provided refuge for these raiders. The Gutians contributed to the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire, and later briefly dominated parts of Elam. Later, in the second millennium, a third group, the Kassites, emerged from the Zagros as another major factor. After Hammurabi's Babylonian Empire fell, the Kassites took advantage of the power vacuum and ruled Babylonia for 400 years, one of the longest dynasties in Mesopotamia. While Elam was writing and fighting on the western edge, a different kind of civilization was taking shape along the Helmand River to the east. At Shari Sokta, meaning burnt city, in today's Sistan, a Helmand culture settlement founded around 3200 BCE grew rapidly into a large, carefully planned city, soon occupying over 100 hectares, public buildings on raised platforms, and an enormous cemetery spread over the plain. Fine painted pottery, stone gaming boards, carved lapis beads, and even an artificial eye and a skull with evidence of trepanation speak of a complex society with artisans, priests, perhaps administrators. Upstream, across the modern border in Afghanistan, Mundigak became the Helmand culture's chief city on that side. Its occupation begins around the early 4th millennium BCE as a modest farming village. By the later 3rd millennium, it boasts monumental architecture, a palace complex on a high mound, a separate temple with buttressed walls, and well-built houses around them. Its material culture links it to both the Iranian plateau and the pre-Harappan cultures of Baluchistan and the Indus borderlands. Other sites, Sahid Kala Tepe, Dehmurasi Gundai, and settlements in the Sistan Basin, share the same Helmand pottery and building styles. West of Helmand, in the valleys of Kerman, around the Halil Rud, another cluster of settlements produced a different but equally distinctive art, part of the Jiroft culture. At Jiroft and nearby Konasandal, thousands of carved chlorite vessels, some found, many sadly looted, display intricate scenes. Eagle-headed beings, or snakes twined around stylized trees. Workshops at Tepe Yahya show that such chlorite vases were manufactured in southeastern Iran and exported widely. Cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia mention a rich eastern land called Mahashi, famed for gems and carved stone. This could be Jiroft region, tying the chlorite workshops and the legends together. The Sumerian epics also speak of Aratta, a distant mountainous land that traded with Uruk and Sumer. And some Iranian archaeologists have proposed that Jiroft might be Aratta. These eastern cultures, Helmand and Jiroft, controlled long stretches of river and oasis, and played their own part in the new Bronze Age web of exchange. From about 2600 BCE, the third great urban civilization of the Old World came into full being farther east. The Indus Valley Civilization, or Harappan culture, with its brick-built cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Our region lies between these Indus cities and the Mesopotamian plain, so almost inevitably, the highlands became the bridge. Mesopotamian texts from the Akkadian and Neo-Sumerian periods list three main sources of foreign goods: Dilmun, present-day Bahrain, Magan, or Oman, and Meluha, the Indus region. On the Afghan side of the mountains, a small settlement called Shotugai, on the Amu Darya in modern Takhar province, preserves the Harappan's northernmost outpost. Founded around 2000 BCE, Shotugai was a true Indus colony. Its position, close to the lapis mines, was to secure access to the bluestone for export back to the Indus and beyond. Meanwhile, somewhere near the junction of the Coast and Sai valleys in northern Afghanistan, farmers ploughed up something remarkable in 1966. A hoard of gold and silver bowls and cups, 20 or so vessels, hammered and embossed, bearing images of bearded bulls, snakes, boars, and mountain goats. This is the treasure of Tepe Fulol, dated roughly to the late 3rd millennium. The combination of local and foreign motifs and the very existence of such wealth show that northern Afghanistan by this time belonged firmly to the same long-distance trade network as Susa, Ur, and Mohenjo-daro. Around 2200 BCE, something went wrong. Across the Near East, lake levels dropped. We see tree rings narrow, and cuneiform tablets complain of famine. Modern climatologists call it the 4.2 kilo-year event, a prolonged episode of aridification that coincides with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, upheavals in Egypt's Old Kingdom, and widespread settlement decline. In the Helmand Basin, this climatic shock probably accelerated processes already underway. At Shari Sokhtar, occupation shrank and then ceased by about 1800. Mundigak in Afghanistan, though it continued, never again reached its earlier urban peak. Some of the Helmand settlements show signs of abandonment, leaving earlier quarters to drift back into dust. Centuries later, when Iranian poets and priests tried to imagine their deep past, they told how the shining king Jamshid presided over a golden age. The line began with Keyumars, who taught humans to clothe themselves in leopard skins, and his descendants like Hushang and Tamuras, who introduced farming, fire, and crafts to humanity. By Jamshid's reign, he divided society into priests, warriors, and farmers. He even stretched out his hand and subdued demons. Then pride overtook him. He lost his divine glory, and a monstrous tyrant, Zahak, seized the throne, cutting Jamshid in half. No archaeologist can dig up Jamshid or Zahak, but the pattern their tale describes, the technical brilliance, followed by environmental stress and political upheaval, is reflected in the archaeological record. Myth here could be some distant memory, just bent and burnished by 1,000 years of storytelling. To the north and east in Margiana, around modern Merv, and Bactria, in northern Afghanistan, the story was different. There, the drying of older channels seems to have prompted a reorganization, not total collapse. Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi, digging in Turkmenistan and northern Afghanistan in the 1970s, called this world the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC. Others call it simply the Oxus civilization. The hoard at Tepe Fulol is thought to be part of this BMAC world. Between about 2400 and 1600, at Gonodepe in Margiana, a walled town around 50 hectares grew, with a royal sector, residential districts, and a necropolis. In some buildings, raised platforms and ash-filled basins look very much like fire altars. South of the walls, a cemetery contained rich burials, gold, silver, bronze, carnelian, and lapis beads, and carved stone Bactrian princesses, composite female figurines made of chlorite and alabaster, cloaked and crowned. At Gonur, excavators found equid bones and, in one royal grave, the skeleton of a foal placed with a four-wheeled wagon whose wooden wheels had bronze bands. It seems that horses, or at least horse-drawn vehicles, had entered the ritual life of the Oxus elites by around 2200 BCE. On the Afghan side, Dashli III in Jaujian province was the major BMAC site. The Oxus civilization's artisans learned to work metal and stone with extraordinary skill. They farmed wheat and barley with irrigation and kept sheep, goats and cattle. They also connected to the outside world. Carnelian from the Indus and lapis from Badakhshan also appear together in Oxus tombs. Most intriguingly of all were reported traces of ephedra, poppy, and cannabis in ceramic vessels. It is thought that these were ingredients in a ritual intoxicant, perhaps an ancestor of the Hyoma drink in later Iranian society, or the Soma drink praised in Vedic hymns. By the Late Bronze Age, the Middle Elamite period began when rulers based in the highlands of Anshan and the lowland capital of Susa forged a more unified kingdom. The first dynasty usually listed is the Kidinnuid group. Rulers now styled themselves kings of Anshan and Susa and set the stage for stronger, more centralized royal projects. Under the next dynasty, the Igihilkids, Elam navigated a world dominated in Mesopotamia by Kassite Babylonia and increasingly Assyria. One of the defining Middle Elamite moments is the foundation of Chogazanbil by Untashnapirisha. It was built as a major cult center with a ziggurat, where deities of the highlands and lowlands were worshipped together. The late Middle Elamite period is dominated by the Shutrukid dynasty when Elam reached its most famous expansionist height. King Shutruk-Nahunte and his successors campaigned into Babylonia, ending the 400-year Kassite dynasty, and carried prestigious monuments back to Susa, including the stele of Hammurabi's laws, the victory stele of Naram-Sin, and most insultingly, the statue of the god Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. But did Elam disrupt a delicate balance of power? And would this lead to its own downfall? Meanwhile, back in the east, as farmers of the Oxus civilization were building canals and temples, herders on the Eurasian steppe to the north were making their own innovations. In the forest steppe east of the Urals, the Sintashta culture and its successors developed the first light, spoked-wheel chariots with horses and buried their warrior charioteers in elaborate tombs. Many scholars regard these steppe communities as the origin of Proto-Indo-Iranian languages, ancestors of both the Indo-Aryans who entered India and the Iranians who remained further west. By the Late Bronze Age, during the 2nd millennium BCE, groups associated with the broader Andronovo horizon, which formed an Indo-Iranian continuum across a huge area, expanded south from the smaller Sintasha homeland towards the oases and mountains. They brought with them a pastoral economy and their languages. This brought the steppe herders in direct contact with the settled populations of Bactria and Margiana. In some places, Andronovo-style ceramics and burial customs appear alongside BMAC architecture, suggesting coexistence. But in others, fortified Oxus sites show signs of destruction or sharp change, so not all integration was peaceful. In yet others, Oxus traditions simply fade, replaced by the handmade pottery and hilltop forts that archaeologists associate with the Yaz culture, the post-BMAC oasis tradition with strong Andronovo and steppe assimilation. Some Andronovo migrants had split earlier, and contact with the BMAC was less genetic and more linguistic. And this stream became the Indo-Aryans. They moved further east and into the Punjab. Their hymns, preserved in the Rigveda, remember rivers in Afghanistan like the Kuba, the Haraksvati and others. and perhaps their poets composed some of their verses in or near Afghan valleys before entering India. Another stream stayed in or returned to the plateau and the Central Asian oases. These became the Iranians. As the Oxus civilization declined after 1700 BCE, the Yaz culture continued into the Iron Age. Yaz I, the earliest phase, is thought to be the common archaeological ancestor for the Iranian peoples. Yaz had almost no formal burials, quite a contrast to the rich Bimak graveyards. It's thought that the dead were left to corpse exposure rather than burial. The pattern fits the later Zoroastrian idea that the dead body pollutes earth and must first be exposed to the elements. No one in the Yaz settlements left inscriptions, and we cannot tie any single part to any single named tribe. Yet when later written sources speak of Eastern Iranian peoples, Bactrians, Sogdians, their homelands often coincide with the distribution of Yaz sites and their successors. Somewhere in this early Iron Age landscape, either in Eastern Iran or Central Asia, a religious reformer, later known as Zarathustra or Zoroaster, preached a new way of understanding the world. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian sacred texts, give him no direct dates. Avestan was one of the two attested branches of Old Iranian. Zoroaster's hymns, the Gathas, suggest a world of clan chiefs, cattle herds, and struggling farmers. Society seems divided into priests and warriors, as raids and counter-raids disturb the peace of the pastures. Against this backdrop, the prophet Zoroaster proclaims that behind the many gods stands one wise lord, Ahura Mazda, creator of all that is good. The Devas, a word which would come to denote the good gods in Indo-Aryan tradition, were cast as false, demonic beings. He speaks of a cosmic struggle between truth, or Asher, and the lie, or Druj, in which each human choice you make has weight. Fire also becomes a central symbol of purity and truth. Later tradition says that Zoroaster gained the patronage of a ruler named Vishtaspa, sometimes identified with a Bactrian or Eastern Iranian king. Under Vishtaspa's protection, the new doctrine spread among Eastern Iranian tribes. It is tempting to see Zoroastrianism solidified in the Yaz culture. Some scholars have even argued that even the Bronze Age Oxus civilization was already Proto-Zoroastrian. But it seems very likely that the religious world in which Zoroaster lived and reshaped grew out of the fusion of steppe Indo-Iranian beliefs with the ritual traditions of the Oxus oases and Iranian plateau. While Eastern Iranians were cultivating their oases and listening to new hymns, other Iranian-speaking groups pressed westward into the Zagros and Central Plateau. The common word Arya, which Iranians used to describe themselves, eventually gave its name to the land. From Old Persian, Arya, comes Middle Persian, Iran, and by New Persian, Iran, land of the Aryans. As these tribes settled and fought, they began to weave their memories into stories. Centuries later, these stories would be collected and reshaped into the great Persian epic, the Shahnameh. In the epic, Zahak the usurper continued his reign of chaos, but was overthrown by the hero Feridun and the blacksmith Kaveh, and order was restored. Feridun then divides the world between his sons. To Salm, he gives the west. To Tur, the northeast lands beyond the Oxus, known as Turan. To Iraj, the beloved youngest, he gives the central realm, Iran. But jealousy overcomes Sam and Tur, and they murder their brother, beginning an unending feud. These wars, fought by heroes like Rustam on the Iranian side and Afrasiab, the king of Turan, likely echo the conflicts between settled Iranians and the nomadic tribes of Central Asia in the early Iron Age. By the end of those tales, a new royal line, the Kayanian dynasty, emerges in Iran's legendary history. No one would mistake these tales for reality, but they preserve the sense Iranians had of inhabiting a central land ringed by rivals. In the centuries to come, these valleys and plateaus would give the world the Medes, Persians, and others. Back in the west, Susa is captured. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar I, campaigned into Elam, and sacked the city in retaliation for the earlier raids. Babylon recovered the sacred statue of Marduk, and Elam would enter a dark age, remaining in the shadows for over 300 years. As the Iron Age dawned, the Zagros Mountains and the highlands of western Iran were a wild frontier from Mesopotamia's vantage point. Assyrian kings, expansionist and ever in search of tribute, began probing these regions. They found there a mosaic of petty kingdoms and tribal confederations, some indigenous, some newcomers. Among them were the Mada, known to history as the Medes. The Assyrians first mentioned the Medes around 834 BCE, when King Shalmaneser III boasted of a campaign through their land. But by subjugating some Median chiefs while failing to conquer them outright, Assyrian pressure forced the Median tribes to cooperate and organize it more tightly. In essence, fear of the Great Assyrian war machine was a crucible in which the Medes began forging unity. The broader region at this time was a checkerboard of powers. To the northwest of Media lay Urartu, in today's Armenia, an advanced kingdom that vied with Assyria for dominance. South of Media, in lowland Khuzestan, the ancient Elamite kingdom still held on, in a Neo-Elamite phase. Its cities like Susa had millennia of history, but Elam's heyday had long passed, and it entered a dark age after being sacked by Babylon. Scattered to the north were the Manians, another small kingdom entangled in the Assyro-Urartian wars. And to the east, on the Iranian plateau and beyond, stretched lesser-known lands where Iranian nomads roamed and settled. Assyrian records mention a place called Parsua, or Parsuash, around 744. This Parsua seems to have been a precursor to the Persians' later homeland further south. These early Persians were just one of several subject peoples paying horse tributes to Assyria. Throughout the 8th and early 7th centuries, Assyrian kings Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II and Esarhaddon claimed dominion in parts of Media. Yet full conquest eluded the Assyrians. The terrain was rugged, the Median clans elusive. Assyrian annals after 670 fall relatively silent about Media, and in the early 7th century the Medes reappeared on the stage in a far more formidable guise. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing centuries later, tells a dramatic tale of how the Medes united. In his account, a clever Median named Deioces won such repute as an impartial judge that the Median tribes chose him as their first king to impose law and order on a lawless land. Deioces, Herodotus claims, built Ecbatana as a magnificent capital, encircled by 7 concentric walls of different colors. It's possible that Deioces was a legendary figure, or a local chief later glorified, and that Ecbatana did exist as a settlement, but the archaeological record has not revealed early monumental remains there. What we do know with more certainty is that by the mid-7th century BCE, the Medes, under a king Phraortes, were on the move. Phraortes, said to be the son of Deioces, expanded Median rule by subduing the Persians and other neighboring peoples. But he was killed in a war against Assyria. Phraortes' accomplishments were then cut short by yet another foe from the north. A mass of nomadic Iranic horsemen from the Eurasian steppe, the Scythians, called Saka or Turanian raiders in the east, are said to have swept down through Media around 620 BCE. Perhaps allies to Assyria, the Scythians ruled here for 28 years, behaving like tyrants. That is, until the Median princes managed to massacre their leaders at a banquet while they were intoxicated. When the Scythian storm passed, a more formidable Median state emerged from the chaos, now under a leader of true historic stature, King Cyaxares. Under King Cyaxares, who took the Median throne around 625 BCE, Media decisively entered the ranks of great powers. Both the Babylonian chronicles and later Greek accounts attested to the Medes' pivotal role in the final overthrow of the dominant Mesopotamian Empire, Assyria. Cyaxares is credited by Herodotus with reforming the Median army, organizing infantry and cavalry, and plotting the overthrow of the Scythians. the Median forces marched west, allying with the rebelling Babylonians under Nabopolassar. 2 years later came the grand prize. Its walls breached after a bloody siege, Nineveh, Assyria's capital, fell in 612 BCE. The Medes and Babylonians sacked the city in a frenzy of revenge, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell. In the ruins of Nineveh, the proud lion of Assyria was laid low, and a new balance of power was born. For the next few decades, Media stood alongside Babylon, Egypt and Lydia as one of the great kingdoms of the Near East. Cyaxares expanded Median control in every direction, and to the west, his armies pressed into eastern Anatolia. In 585, the Medes clashed with the kingdom of Lydia. But a shadow fell over the field, literally. According to Greek sources, as the armies battled on the Halys River, a sudden solar eclipse darkened the sky. Seeing it as omen, both sides laid down arms and negotiated peace. The Halys was fixed as the boundary between Lydia and Media. To the north, the Medes likely asserted dominance over Armenia and the Caucasus. To the east, their influence extended across Ariana, perhaps as far as the deserts of Central Asia, though direct evidence is scant, and their reach is difficult to pin down. Media left no royal archives for us to read, but it did leave something else. At sites like Tepe-Nushi-Jan, excavators uncovered a cluster of monumental buildings, a fort, columned hall, and temple structures, associated with the period when the Medes consolidated influence around Hamadan. Yet these Median sites also underline why Media remains slippery. They can show us that elites existed and invested in religion and defense, but they cannot tell us how far a king's command reached, how taxes were collected, or whether Cyaxares truly ruled to the Oxus or merely led a powerful coalition. Cyaxares died shortly after the Battle of the Eclipse, and his son Astyages inherited the Median throne. Astyages' reign was less warlike and more decadent, a time when the Median court at Ecbatana now enjoyed its supremacy. One colourful Greek story claims Astyages had a troubling dream about his daughter, who was married off to a Persian vassal prince from Anshan, Cambyses. In the dream, her son would overthrow him. That grandson was none other than a baby named Cyrus. The tale goes that the king, fearing the prophecy, ordered the young Cyrus to be killed, but the baby was secretly saved and raised by a shepherd, a classic mythic motif, echoing Sargon of Akkad or Moses. The Medes had long counted the Persians among their subordinate allies, but a rift grew between them. Astyages evidently also alienated some powerful Medians, notably his general Harpagus. In 550, these tensions exploded, and Cyrus of Anshan, now an adult, rebelled against the Medes. The fall of the Median Empire came quickly. Astyages mustered his army to crush Cyrus, but Harpagus betrayed his king on the battlefield, turning the Median troops over to Cyrus. The Median capital, Ecbatana, fell to the Persians without extensive destruction. With this, Cyrus II inherited the domains of Media. The Medes were not annihilated, instead assimilated into the new empire as partners. Medes continued to hold high office, and Persian kings adopted Median court customs and dress, and Ecbatana remained an important royal city. But political dominance had passed to the Persians. Cyrus, a dynamic leader from a once marginal tribe, was now master of Iran. To understand why Cyrus's rise could be so swift, we take a glance at Persia, before it became a centralized state. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the region that later becomes the Persian heartland already had a long history. It was contested ground in the shadow of a much older civilization. Elam, the city of Anshan, had been tied to Elam for centuries, rising with Elamite fortunes during its height during the Middle Period. This matters because when Iranian-speaking pastoral groups filtered into Persis in small waves, they mingled with, displaced, and inherited from Elamite society, and the future Persian state grew inside that inheritance. By the late 7th century, the old balance in the southwest cracked. After Assyria's devastating assaults on Elam, including the famous sack of Susa, Elam's grip weakened, leaving a power vacuum. In later royal genealogies, Persian kings trace their line through early ancestors like the legendary Achaemenids, Teispes, and their descendants like Cambyses. But it was Cyrus II, revered as Cyrus the Great, who stands as a towering figure at the juncture of history and legend. He swiftly transformed the inheritance of Media into the Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. After seizing Media, Cyrus moved against Lydia, the wealthy Anatolian kingdom ruled by the fabled King Croesus. Croesus of Sardis was known for his immense riches. It is even said the concept of coinage in gold and silver was pioneered in Lydia. According to Herodotus, Croesus, misinterpreting an oracle's prophecy, initiated war against Cyrus, only to be defeated. In 546, Cyrus captured Sardis, Lydia's capital, in a dramatic battle and siege. With Lydia came the Greek city-states of Ionia along the Aegean coast, which were part of the kingdom. This brought the Persians into direct contact with the Greek world. By the late 540s, Cyrus marched into the Mesopotamian plain to confront Babylon, ruled by Nabonidus. Babylon was, at that time, the heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the most prestigious city in the Near East, ruling over Mesopotamia and the Levant. In 539 BCE, Cyrus's army defeated the Babylonians at the Battle of Opis on the Tigris and entered Babylon without a fight. The city surrendered, its gates opened from within. Cyrus famously declared a general amnesty and performed religious pieties to win over the populace. The most illuminating window into this event is the Cyrus Cylinder, an inscription in Akkadian cuneiform buried in Babylon as a foundation text. In it, Cyrus presents himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, chosen by the chief Babylonian god Marduk. He denounces Nabonidus as a blasphemous tyrant and boasts, "I entered Babylon in peace amidst joy and rejoicing. I relieved their weariness and freed them from their servitude." The cylinder goes on to describe how Cyrus restored temples and sanctuaries across the lands and repatriated displaced peoples to their homes. This accords with the biblical tradition as well, which lauds Cyrus for allowing the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This earned him the title of Messiah, the Anointed One. The Cyrus Cylinder, while not explicitly mentioning the Jews, confirms that Cyrus saw himself as a patron of all subject peoples' religions, declaring that, "I returned the images of the gods to their sanctuaries and let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and restored to them their dwellings." By upholding local cults and presenting himself as the chosen of Babylon's own deity, Cyrus avoided resistance and gained legitimacy. It's often remarked as an early charter of human rights, praising Cyrus's enlightened approach towards diversity, especially when compared to the Assyrians' habit of terror and deportation. With Babylon's fall, Cyrus was the most powerful ruler in the world. From the Indus River in the east to the gates of Egypt in the west, from the Caucasus and Central Asia in the north to the Arabian deserts in the south, virtually all of Southwest Asia was under Persian dominion. A Babylonian document lists Cyrus's titles as King of Persia, King of Anshan, King of Media, King of Babylon, King of Sumer, and Akkad, King of the four corners of the world. Inscriptions indicate Cyrus even held sway in eastern Iran, having subdued regions like Parthia, Sogdiana, and Drangiana. Only Egypt remained as a notable independent kingdom in the Near East, but that was a challenge left to Cyrus's successors. The Persian king's final campaign took him to the far northeast, where he confronted the steppe tribes beyond the Oxus. In 530 BCE, while fighting the Massagetae, a nomadic confederation of the eastern branch of the Scythian steppe people in Central Asia, Cyrus was killed in battle. Herodotus relates the gory legend that Queen Tomyris of the Massagetae defeated him, and, in vengeance for her son's death, dunked Cyrus's severed head in a wineskin of blood. So died Cyrus the Great, buried at his capital of Pasargadae in Persis, in a simple gabled stone tomb which still stands today. The Greek historian Xenophon would later write a laudatory biography of Cyrus, the Cyropedia, painting him as the ideal ruler, and the text would later influence Machiavelli's The Prince in the 16th century. Pasargadae was revered, and they inscribed on his tomb, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians an empire and was king of Asia. Do not begrudge me this monument." Cyrus's sudden death left his newly forged empire in the hands of his son, Cambyses II. Cambyses, though often overshadowed by his father and by his successor, continued the streak of Persian expansion with one of history's boldest conquests in the land of the pharaohs. In 525 BCE, Cambyses led the Persian army, which included not only Persians and Medes, but contingents from all the subjugated lands across the Sinai into Egypt. This was the last major power of the Near East still unconquered. At the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III, and soon after he entered the rich city of Memphis. Egypt, with its immemorial civilization of pharaohs, became just another satrapy of the Persians. Cambyses assumed the titles of pharaoh and performed sacrificial rites to the Egyptian gods, although later Greek tales, likely propaganda, accused him of impiety and madness, like stabbing the Apis bull, a sacred deity of Memphis. Buoyed by success, Cambyses attempted further campaigns, sending an army to conquer the oasis of Siwa, an army which mysteriously vanished in a sandstorm, and a fleet towards Nubia, which turned back due to logistical strain. These setbacks and his long absence from Persia weakened Cambyses' position, and a dynastic crisis unfolded. Cambyses had left his younger brother Bardia at home, but in Cambyses' absence, an impostor claiming to be Bardia, Gomata the Magus, seized the throne in 522. Cambyses hastened back, but died en route. The empire teetered on chaos, as every major region from Elam to Egypt saw local leaders declaring independence. Into this breach stepped Darius, a young Persian of the Achaemenid royal line, although not directly in Cyrus's lineage. Darius and a group of loyal nobles assassinated the usurper Gomata in September, but winning the throne in the capital was just the start. The rebellions across the empire needed to be crushed. Darius chronicled this struggle in extraordinary detail in the famous Behistun inscription, a monumental trilingual text he carved high on a cliff in the Zagros Mountains. In the inscription, written in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian, Darius recounts how after Cambyses died, there was a place where previously demons were worshipped. Afterwards, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, I destroyed that sanctuary of demons. Where the demons were worshipped, there I worshipped Ahura Mazda. This refers to the usurper's rule as a victory of false religion that Darius then overturned to reinforce the Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Darius lists 19 battles against various pretenders and rebels. In Babylon, in Elam, in Media, Sagatia, Armenia, Parthia, Margiana, everywhere someone had proclaimed themselves king. The Behistun relief sculpture above the text dramatically depicts Darius as a tall figure placing his foot on a defeated Gomata, while 9 of these rebel kings stand before him with ropes around their necks. Darius proclaims that he defeated them all by the grace of Ahura Mazda and restored order. The trilingual inscription made it a type of Rosetta Stone for cuneiform and was vital to modern decipherment of these scripts. But to his contemporaries, Darius was telling the world that he, chosen by the supreme god, had quashed the lie and set the empire right. With the rebellions crushed by 520 BCE, Darius undertook a mission to organize and stabilize the empire like never before. If Cyrus was the founding conqueror, Darius was the master organizer and lawgiver of the Achaemenids. Darius's empire also pressed against a far older, less easily conquered adversary, the steppe. To the northwest moved the Saka and other Iranian-speaking nomadic confederations, people of horse and bow, who could strike, vanish and return before a heavy infantry army could force a decisive battle. Darius himself records a campaign against the Saka Tigrak Sauda, those who wear pointed hats. Darius and his army defeated them, capturing their leader, at this time named Skunksa, and installed a loyal chief in his place. Having secured the heartlands, Darius also sought to push boundaries. He sent a naval expedition, led by a Greek mariner Scylax of Carianda, to explore the Indus River around 515 BCE. Just a few years later, Darius used the information to annex the Indus region. Darius also campaigned in Europe. Around 513 BCE, he crossed the Bosphorus and marched into Thrace, seeking to subdue the Scythians north of the Danube. The Scythian campaign was inconclusive as the nomads kept evading pitched battle. Darius eventually withdrew, but he left behind Persian garrisons that at least established control in Thrace and Macedon. In art and architecture, Darius left a magnificent legacy. He moved the political center to Persepolis, constructing there a palatial complex that was as much a statement of imperial ideology as it was a functional seat of government. Set on a grand terrace against a mountainside, Persepolis was adorned with audience halls, porticos, and exquisite bas-reliefs. Darius's craftsmen, who included not only Persians, but Medes, Elamites, Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Greeks, and others, was truly an international workforce, and their fusion created a distinctive Achaemenid style. The Apadana Palace featured 72 stone columns, each 20 meters tall, with capitals carved as twin bulls or lions, combining Mesopotamian columnar concepts with Iranian animal motifs. The reliefs along the staircases, as mentioned, show processions of tribute bearers from every nation, guided by Persian officers, an artistic vision of harmonious diversity under Persian rulership. Elements of Persepolitan art were likely influenced by Greek artists in Persian service. There was no split between East and West, and Greek artisans and physicians found employment at the Achaemenid court, while Persian gold found its way into Greek treasuries. Persian palaces were decorated by Ionian Greek craftsmen, and Persian tastes, exotic luxuries, and brightly coloured clothes influenced the elite in lands as far as Athens. He systematically divided the empire into satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap who was often of Persian or Median nobility. These satrapies corresponded largely to the peoples and kingdoms that had been conquered. An inscription of Darius enumerates all the realms that bore him tribute and did his will. This astonishing catalogue of nations, many of which are depicted bringing offerings on the stone reliefs of Persepolis, shows how ethnically and geographically diverse the empire was. On the great Apadana relief at Persepolis, Darius's new ceremonial capital, delegations of subject peoples parade in native dress. Among them, one can spot Bactrians leading Bactrian camels, Sogdians from even further past the Oxus, Gandharans from the Kabul Valley, alongside Lydians with their chariots, Ionian Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. Many peoples, one empire, held together by the great king. Several of these tribute-bearing lands lay to the rich east: Aria, Arachosia, Drangiana, and beyond them, Bactria and Sogdiana to the north, and Gandhara and Satagidia toward the Indus frontier. Often overlooked in the Persian Empire, these regions were an organized part of imperial life. Evidence from Arachosia shows that imperial administration reached far into the southeast. A small group of Achaemenid period Elamite administrative fragments found at Old Kandahar has been interpreted as a hint that provincial record-keeping there resembled the administrative habits visible at Persepolis. Scholars have even suggested that such fragments point toward a now-lost local archive, a provincial counterpart to the great fortification records of the Persian heartland. Move west and south to get to Drangiana, the Helmand-Hammon region straddling today's eastern Iran and southwestern Afghanistan. Here, unlike in many provinces, archaeology gives you something unusually concrete: Dahane Goleman, a large Achaemenid period settlement that has been argued to be a provincial capital. It is one of the only major provincial centres from the Achaemenid Empire surviving in recognizable form. In the north, Bactria mattered for the same reason Babylon mattered. It anchored a whole frontier world. It faced the steppe peoples beyond Sogdiana, controlled routes over and around the Hindu Kush, and sat in a land rich enough to fund both tribute or rebellion. Darius's reign is often considered a golden age of the Achaemenid Empire, a time when it reached peak efficiency, prosperity, and artistic expression. Economically, Darius introduced a standardized coinage system, minting gold darics and silver shekels, which facilitated trade across his vast realm. He also standardized weights and measures and instituted regular tribute. Herodotus notes that India, the 20th satrapy, paid a tribute of 360 talents of gold dust, far exceeding all other provinces, reflecting the fabled wealth of the Indus region. To move troops, goods and information swiftly across such a sprawling expanse, Darius built or improved the Royal Road, a grand highway from Susa, one of the imperial capitals, to Sardis, spanning some 2,500 kilometers. At intervals along this road were posting stations and fresh horses. Herodotus marveled at the royal couriers who galloped along this route. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Merchants could pass from the Aegean to the Indus under the Pax Persica's security, the Persian peace. Darius positioned himself as a protector of the traditional order and the Zoroastrian faith. In his inscriptions, Darius consistently invokes Ahura Mazda as the highest god. He proclaims, "A great god is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth and yonder sky, who created man, who made Darius king." In the Persepolis fortification tablets, there are references that suggest the state supported fire altars and rituals consistent with Zoroastrian practice. The Achaemenid realm at this point was arguably the largest empire in history up to that time, spanning 3 continents. Greek calculations put the empire's population at about 50 million, an astonishing 40% plus of the world's population in 480 BCE, truly a world empire for its age. By the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the Achaemenid Persian Empire ruled over an array of peoples and landscapes, from the highland farms of Anatolia to the irrigated river valleys of Mesopotamia, from the oases of Central Asia to the cities of the Nile. The empire's strength lay in a delicate balance of central authority and local autonomy. Politically, the Shah Anshar, or King of Kings, as Darius and his successors titled themselves, was the absolute authority. Yet in practice, he governed through the structures of the peoples he conquered. The empire's official administrative language was Aramaic, often called Imperial Aramaic. This Semitic tongue, already widely used in the Near East, was adopted as a convenient lingua franca for decrees and correspondence across the empire. From Elephantine in Egypt, we find Aramaic writings related to a temple, where Elephantine Jews invoked multiple gods, perhaps even before the Torah became normalized. One of the most important pieces of Aramaic narrative literature we have from that era is the story of Ahikar, a royal advisor for the Assyrian king, who is sentenced to death but escapes with a vengeance. We then head to Bactria, where Aramaic script documents like the Kandahar fragment have been found. This language enabled communication in a script much simpler than cuneiform. Letters and accounts tied to the court of a Bactrian satrap named Akvamazda and a subordinate governor Bagavant offer internal provincial correspondence. These texts give us the daily mechanics of rule. Meanwhile, the Persians themselves continued to use Elamite and Babylonian cuneiform for internal record keeping, as thousands of clay tablets from Susa and Persepolis indicate. In terms of economics, the empire created a vast zone of internal free trade. Lapis lazuli from Bactria travelled west, and gold and spices from India came via Gandhara and Sindh. Gold dust was so abundant in India that Herodotus wrote of gold-digging ants. Fine linen and grain came from Egypt, cedar timber from Phoenicia, wine and olive oil from Syria and Ionia, and horses from Armenia and Media, all circulated under the imperial peace. The empire's economy was still largely agrarian, depending on the fertility of the Nile, Mesopotamia, and Indus to support the imperial coffers. But Persians themselves were also innovators in agriculture, spreading the use of the qanat, the underground irrigation canal system, which tapped groundwater and conveyed it long distances to fields, a technique that made Iran's arid plateau bloom. One striking facet of Persian rule was the interaction with the Greek world. The Ionian Greeks of Asia Minor, having come under Persian dominion after Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, coexisted uneasily with their new masters. The Persians installed Greek tyrants or local proxies to govern these Ionian cities, but these cities valued their autonomy. In 499 BCE, they erupted in the Ionian Revolt, a desperate uprising supported by Athens and Eretria from Greece. Darius moved swiftly, and by 494 the revolt was crushed, and its epicenter, the great Ionian city of Miletus, was punished harshly. But the revolt set the stage for the famous Greco-Persian Wars. Darius, determined to chastise Athens for meddling, sent an expedition across the Aegean. In a shocking upset, it met defeat at the Battle of Marathon in 490, where the Athenians repelled the Persian landing force. Darius planned a greater invasion, but died before it could be launched. The torch passed to his son Xerxes, who would soon lead one of antiquity's most storied campaigns against the Greeks. Xerxes inherited his father Darius's vast empire and his unfinished business in Greece. But before turning west, Xerxes had to secure his throne from challenges at home. Early in his reign, Egypt rebelled, and Xerxes marched south to re-subjugate it, dealing with it more harshly than his predecessors. He removed the pharaonic title from his official titulary and integrated Egypt more tightly as a satrapy, and even reputedly plundering some temples, with Greek sources saying he carried off the statue of the god Amun. Babylon too rebelled around 482 BCE, and Xerxes crushed it, there too allegedly destroying Babylon's chief idol of Marduk in retribution. With the empire pacified, Xerxes amassed a colossal force to invade mainland Greece. In the spring of 480 BCE, 200,000 troops and camp followers set out from Sardis, crossing the Hellespont on pontoon bridges that Xerxes ordered engineered. This grand army, exaggerated as 2 million people according to Herodotus, included contingents from many kinds of men across the empire. It was a moving demonstration of Achaemenid might and multi-ethnicity. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, King Leonidas of Sparta and a small Greek allied force made a legendary stand, holding off Xerxes' hordes for 3 days before being outflanked and slain. Xerxes pressed on, captured and evacuated Athens, and ostentatiously burned the temples on the Acropolis, retaliation for the burning of Sardis in the Ionian Revolt. But that same year, the Persian fleet was lured into the Straits of Salamis, where the nimble triremes of the Greeks, under Athenian general Themistocles, won a stunning victory. Xerxes, fearing his line of retreat could be cut, withdrew with part of his army back to Asia, leaving a large force under Mardonius to continue the war. The next summer, at Plataea, the Greeks decisively defeated the Persian army, slaying Mardonius, while on the very same day the remaining Persian fleet was destroyed at Mycale in Ionia. These twin victories ended the Persian threat to Greece and began a Greek counteroffensive in the Aegean. By 449, after sporadic fighting, the Persians and Greeks agreed to a de facto peace, with Persia recognizing the freedom of the Greek cities in Ionia. In Greek memory, these wars loomed large as the defining clash of East and West, the most important fight of their lives. For the Persian Empire, it was just Tuesday. Back within the empire, after Xerxes' costly wars, internal challenges began to simmer. Xerxes himself faced court intrigues and was assassinated in 465 BCE by a conspiracy of his minister and a court eunuch. He was succeeded by Artaxerxes, under whom the empire had to manage the aftermath of war, and a major rebellion in Egypt supported by Athens, which Artaxerxes eventually quelled. Artaxerxes is traditionally associated with events in the Hebrew Bible, with some identifying him as the king who allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to go to Judea to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. His reign was relatively stable, and peace with Athens in 449 freed Persia from Greek wars, so Artaxerxes focused on maintaining the status quo. In the second half of the 5th century, one intriguing cultural shift occurred. Artaxerxes II is known to have explicitly worshipped additional deities. The imperial cult was expanding beyond the austere monotheism to include other popular Iranian gods, perhaps a reflection of evolving Zoroastrian theology that venerated Yazatas, worthy divinities like Mithra and Anahita. Meanwhile, art and architecture continued to flourish. Successors of Darius finished and added to Persepolis. Xerxes built a palace of his own, and the grand gateway of all nations. Extravagant projects continued, draining the treasury but leaving a wealth of artistic marvels. Persian artisans also produced exquisite luxury goods, jewelry, engraved seals, and drinking vessels of precious metal called rhytons. The so-called Oxus treasure, found near the Oxus River in Bactria, gives a dazzling glimpse of Achaemenid wealth in the east. It contained about 180 gold and silver objects. One famous piece is a gold model chariot, with 4 tiny horses and a driver, possibly an offering to a temple. As the 5th century turned to the 4th, the Persian Empire remained enormously powerful, but signs of decay were appearing. By the early 4th century, the problem becomes visible in one dramatic episode: the rebellion of Cyrus the Younger against his brother Artaxerxes II. In 401, Cyrus marches inland with a force that includes a famous corps of Greek mercenaries, the 10,000, and meets the royal army at Cunaxa, north of Babylon. Cyrus dies in the battle, and the coup ultimately fails. The Greek mercenaries fight their way home in a retreat that becomes legendary, immortalized by Xenophon, one of the soldiers allied to Cyrus. After this, Artaxerxes II consolidated his power. During the Peloponnesian War and Corinthian War between the Greek city-states, Persian satraps in Asia Minor had funded Sparta's fleet at times, and then later assisted Athens, always aiming to keep the Greeks divided. In 387, as the Greeks were fighting the Corinthian War against one another, Artaxerxes switched sides once again and dictated the king's peace, which forced the Greek cities to accept Persian terms under enforcement by the Spartans. Control of Ionia was ceded to Persia, and guarantees were made that no Greek empire would threaten Persian interests. But later in his reign, another major rebellion known as the Great Satraps' Revolt flared up in the 360s. Several Western satraps, along with Egypt, which broke away and remained independent for decades, challenged the crown. Artaxerxes managed to tamp down the satraps by diplomacy and force. By the time of Artaxerxes III, central authority was restored, as he reconquers Egypt after decades of independence. But this would only be brief, and these internal strains showed the empire's cohesion was weakening. The Persian military, though still formidable, had not fundamentally advanced. The core of the army remained the Immortals, an elite 10,000-unit Persian foot guard, and their multinational infantry and cavalry. But over time, heavy reliance on Greek mercenaries implied a certain stagnation. In the reign of Darius III, these frailties would be viciously exposed by an external threat that had been growing quietly to the west, under Philip II and his son, Alexander. While the Persians had benefited from the infighting in the Greek city-states, so did Macedon to the north. Soon, Philip unified Greece under his hegemony. When Philip's son Alexander took power in 336, he inherited both a strong kingdom and his father's plans to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. In the spring of 334 BCE, the 22-year-old Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Persian territory with an army of Macedonians and allied Greeks, 40,000 strong. The Persians, under Darius III, perhaps underestimated this audacious young king, viewing him initially as just another trouble at the fringe. But Alexander moved with lightning speed and tactical genius. He first smashed the local satrapal forces at the Battle of the Granicus River in Anatolia. This opened the way to the Ionian Greek cities, which welcomed him as liberator. Darius, now alarmed, mustered a large imperial army and personally took command. In 333, they met at Issus in Cilicia. The Persian host, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was constrained in the narrow coastal plain, and Alexander's phalanx and cavalry achieved a decisive victory. Darius fled the field, leaving behind his chariot, his bow, and even his family, who were captured by Alexander. The great Persian Empire seemed invincible no longer. Alexander pressed south along the Phoenician coast. The proud island city of Tyre resisted and was taken after a brutal 7-month siege. Gaza fell after stubborn fighting. By late 332, Egypt, disaffected under Persia, welcomed Alexander, who styled himself liberator and was even crowned as pharaoh in Memphis. Darius, from Babylon, sent envoys offering peace. The deal was to cede all lands west of the Euphrates to Alexander and pay a huge ransom for his family. Alexander rejected the offer, saying there could be only one lord of Asia. In 331 BCE, Darius assembled another grand army, drawing contingents from the far reaches: Bactrians, Sogdians, Indians, Scythian horse archers, as well as the core Persian and Median troops. Darius had learned from Issus and chose an open battlefield suited to his numerically superior forces and war chariots. They met Alexander on the vast plain of Gaugamela in Assyria on October 1st. Despite the Persians' valor and numbers, Alexander's superbly trained Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry punched through. A charge led by Alexander himself caused Darius to lose nerve and flee once more. With his retreat, the Persian army crumbled. Though the empire still stood, the outcome of Gaugamela effectively sealed the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. Soon after, Babylon opened its gates to Alexander. Susa, with its immense treasures, surrendered, and by early 330, Persepolis, the symbolic heart of the empire, was taken. There, in a symbolic act, or possibly in drunken excess, Alexander allowed or ordered the burning of Persepolis' palaces as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens' temples 150 years prior. The great terrace of Persepolis was left a charred shell. Once the city where Darius and Xerxes had received tributes from all nations became a tomb of Achaemenid glory. But Darius was not yet captured. He fled eastward, attempting to rally in Media and then in Parthia. Alexander pursued him relentlessly through the Zagros Mountains onto the Iranian plateau. In midsummer 330 BCE, as Darius was retreating toward Bactria, he was betrayed and murdered by his own nobles. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, and those who hoped perhaps to appease Alexander, left Darius mortally wounded in a baggage cart. When Alexander arrived, according to legend, the Macedonian was moved at the pitiful sight of the last great king dying and gave him a royal funeral. As the Shahnameh continues, it recounts the Kayanian dynasty, and here we find names that finally resonate with history: Kekobad, Kekavus, Khosrow, corresponding to the Avestan Kavi dynasty, and some believe them to faintly echo the Median and early Achaemenid period. One Kayanian king is Vishtasp, or Vishtaspa, who in the epic is a champion fighting against the Turanian invaders from the steppe. The epic's hero Rostam, a giant of a man but loyal to the throne, hails from Zabulistan in the southeast. He and his progeny defend Iran time and again from Turanian aggressors. Many of Rostam's adventures, though mythical, slaying dragons, demons, and doing the labors reminiscent of Hercules, take place in eastern Iran and Central Asia, because these regions remained the most volatile for the early Iranians. In the Shahnameh's narrative, we reach characters like Iskander and Dara. Dara is a Persian rendering of Darius. The epic compresses and distorts Achaemenid history, portraying two successive kings both named Dara, sometimes interpreted as Darius III and perhaps an imagined predecessor, and then depicts Iskandar of Rome, arriving to challenge Dara the Younger, In the Shahnameh, Iskandar, or Alexander, is paradoxically cast not simply as an antagonist, but as a half-Persian. They make him the son of Darius by a Greek princess, giving him Achaemenid blood, thus legitimizing his rule. In Persian lore, Alexander is a world conqueror, a seeker of knowledge, later seeking out the fountain of life. But he is also eventually called Sekundar-i Gojastak, or Alexander the Accursed, in Zoroastrian religious texts, for the crime of burning Persepolis. Back in the east, Bessus of Bactria proclaimed himself the new Achaemenid king, taking the regal name Artaxerxes V, and attempted to continue resistance from the eastern provinces. Over the next 2 years, Alexander campaigned through what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, in one of the most challenging guerrilla wars he ever faced. Facing him were the Eastern Iranians, the Bactrians, Sogdians, and Scythians, and they would not easily submit. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great swept through Persia, toppling the Achaemenid Empire and igniting drastic change across the region. His armies marched east into rugged Bactria and Arachosia in modern Afghanistan, where they met fierce resistance from local tribes. According to Greek sources, Alexander's campaign in Bactria Sogdiana was especially brutal, as the guerrilla warfare was quite different from the large-scale battles of Issus or Gaugamela. His target, Bessus, the self-proclaimed last emperor of the Achaemenids, Artaxerxes V. Bessus had turned on the last legitimate Achaemenid king, leaving him for dead. But as Alexander advanced, Bessus's own Sogdian allies turned against him, and Bessus was captured and handed over to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals and future founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Alexander had Bessus publicly humiliated and executed. Yet even amid conquest, Alexander keenly pursued a policy of synthesis. He married a Bactrian princess, Roxana, daughter of the noble Oxyartes. As part of his broader integration strategy, Alexander trained large numbers of local youths in Macedonian methods, often associated with the Epigoni, traditionally numbered at 30,000. Greek cities named after himself sprang up from Asia Minor to the Hindu Kush, planting seeds of Hellenistic culture on Iranian soil. The burning of Persepolis was a symbolic end to the old order and gave way to new Greco-Macedonian administrations that would coexist with many Achaemenid institutions. But Alexander's sudden death in 323 left little chance of a smooth transition, and his vast realm fractured among his generals. One of these successors, Seleucus I Nicator, took command of Iran and Central Asia by 312 BCE, establishing the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus cemented Hellenistic rule from Mesopotamia to the Indus, ruling eastern Iran from ancient cities like Babylon, and creating new foundations like Seleucia on the Tigris. In these early post-Alexander decades, Greek and Macedonian veterans settled in colonies across the vast realm, mingling with local populations. Hellenistic influence, their art, the Koine Greek language, and city planning all grew in the urban centers, while the countryside remained largely Iranian in culture. Seleucid rulers, emulating Alexander, encouraged intermarriage and honored both Greek gods and local deities. But they also faced the realities of governing a very diverse land. Eastern Iran's powerful noble families and the nomadic tribes beyond the Oxus remained semi-autonomous, but they weren't the only ones. In the northwest, Atropatene emerged as a durable Iranian kingdom, founded by Atropates in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest. In the southwest, local rulers, often called the Frateraka, and later the kings of Persis, retained substantial autonomy, issued distinctive coinage, and preserved Achaemenid legitimacy and religious imagery, but remained loyal to the Seleucids. In the early 3rd century BCE, the Seleucids found a formidable neighbor to the southeast, the Mauryan Empire of India. Seleucus contested territories in modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, with Emperor Chandragupta Maurya around 305 BCE. Ultimately, they forged a diplomatic alliance. Seleucus ceded some of his eastern territories to Chandragupta in exchange for 500 war elephants. This pact fixed the Indo-Iranian frontier, and over the next century, Indian culture and Buddhism penetrated the region under Mauryan patronage. Emperor Ashoka's bilingual edicts reached Kandahar around 260 BCE, written in Greek and Aramaic. Afghanistan's trade flourished as the Mauryans built the precursor to the ancient Grand Trunk Road linking Gandhara to the Indian heartland. Meanwhile, Seleucid power in the north remained intact. Greek administrators governed Bactria, and Hellenistic cities like Iconium were founded on the Oxus river frontier. Archaeologists have uncovered a Greek theatre, gymnasium, and philosophical inscriptions, including Delphic maxims, inscribed in Greek. These finds show Greek settlers transplanting their civic culture to Bactria, while themselves adopting local artistic motifs. But by the mid-3rd century BCE, Seleucid authority began to crack at the far ends of the empire. Distant satraps, empowered by local armies and the weakness of Seleucus's successors, sensed an opportunity for independence. Around 250 BCE, two breakaway dynasties emerged almost simultaneously. First, Diodotus I, the Greek satrap of Bactria, rebelled and declared himself king, establishing the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Contemporary accounts praised Bactria as a rich land of 1,000 cities, positioned at the crossroads of trade to India and China. The defection of Diodotus likely had local support from Iranian nobles in Bactria, who saw an opportunity to free themselves from the distant Seleucid control. The second breakaway dynasty was just to the west. Arsaces, leader of the nomadic Pani tribe, invaded the province of Parthia in northeastern Iran and overthrew the Seleucid governor Andragoras, a much different kind of revolt than in Greco-Bactria. It was a nomadic uprising ejecting Hellenistic rule. Parthian chronicles later claimed Arsaces as a descendant of the Achaemenids to legitimize his dynasty. The regional revolts in Bactria and Parthia birthed two new powers that would reshape Iran and Afghanistan: the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the east and the Arsacid-Parthian Empire in the west. Freed from Seleucid oversight, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom entered a golden age of expansion. Euthydemus, after usurping Diodotus' line, fortified Bactria against nomads and even resisted a Seleucid reconquest. When Antiochus the Great marched east with a large army in 208 BCE, Euthydemus fought him to a standstill at the gates of Bactra. After a 2-year siege, Antiochus agreed to peace, recognizing Euthydemus' kingship in exchange for a token allegiance. This campaign achieved little. The Seleucids granted de facto independence to both Parthia and Bactria to secure their eastern flank. With Seleucid power in Iran waning, especially after their defeat by Rome at Magnesia in 190 BCE, the new dynasties were poised to fill the vacuum. In Bactria, Demetrius used the kingdom's strength to invade South Asia, likely taking advantage of the decline of the Mauryan Empire, which became unstable after Ashoka. Demetrius crossed the Hindu Kush and conquered parts of today's Pakistan around 180 BCE, establishing the Indo-Greek kingdom in the Punjab. Coins of Demetrius and his successors show bilingual Greek Prakrit inscriptions and Indian symbols, a fusion of Greek and Indian cultures, as these Yavana kings ruled over both Greek colonists and local peoples. One of the most famous Indo-Greek kings, Menander, became legendary for his wisdom, and according to later Buddhist texts, his embrace of Buddhism. The Milinda Panha, or Questions of King Milinda, depicts Menander engaging in profound dialogue with the monk Nagasena, and tradition holds that this Greek king adopted the Dharma, even attaining the rank of Arhat, or Enlightened One, by the end of his reign. While this account is literary, both Greek and Indian sources alike remember Menander as a model of benevolent rule. Plutarch writes that after the king's death, his subject towns fought over the honor of his ashes. Under the Indo-Greeks, Gandhara became a thriving crossroads, where Hellenistic art styles meshed with Indian themes, setting the stage for the later flourishing of Greco-Buddhist culture. During this same epoch in western Iran, the Arsacids, or Parthian Empire, was rising to parity with the great powers. After Arsaces' death, his successors gradually expanded Parthian control over the Iranian plateau. A pivotal figure, Mithridates I, transformed Parthia from a small kingdom into a major empire. Capitalizing on the Seleucids' troubles, Mithridates seized Media around 148 BCE and soon after conquered Babylonia, entering Seleucia on the Tigris in 141 with a victorious investiture ceremony. Parthian armies then overran Elam and reached the shores of the Persian Gulf, while in the east, Mithridates annexed parts of Bactria's territory. By the 130s BCE, the Arsacid realm stretched from the borders of Syria to the Oxus River. On his coins, Mithridates was hailed as the Great King Arsaces, Philhellene, a friend of Greek culture. Royal coinage from Mithridates I's era depicts Heracles on the reverse, identified with the Iranian hero Verethrachna. At the same time, the Parthians grounded their rule in Iranian tradition, styling themselves Shah, King of Kings, and maintained fire temples and Zoroastrian rituals, especially as their power became more secure. They established multiple royal capitals. The old city of Hecatompylos, Ctesiphon on the Tigris, grew into a grand capital and would host Arsacid coronations, and Nisa in Parthia, where a royal necropolis and treasury have been excavated. At Nisa, archaeologists have found wine banquet vessels, ivory rhytons, and documents in Aramaic. By 130 BCE, the Seleucid Empire was crumbling to a rump state, and two new spheres of influence, Hellenistic Bactria in the east and Parthia in the west, dominated Greater Iran. But it was at this moment that a storm from the steppes swept in to upend the Hellenistic world in Central Asia. This was a confederation of Indo-European nomads known as the Yuezhi, or Tocharians in Greek sources, migrated southward and invaded Bactria, dealing the death blow to the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Chinese chronicles record that the Yuezhi had been driven from their homelands in Gansu by the Xiongnu, setting off a domino effect of migrations across Central Asia. These horse archer tribes overran northern Bactria, sacked cities, and ended over a century of Greek rule. In the wake of this invasion, the far eastern fragments of Alexander's legacy splintered. Greek rule persisted for a time in the Kabul Valley and Punjab, and Indo-Greek kings like Heliocles and Strato II held on for a while, but they were increasingly isolated. Internecine strife and usurpations had already weakened the Greek regimes, and now Scythian nomads took advantage as well. These were Saka clans from the eastern Scythian world, who swept into parts of Bactria and the Indus. By 100 BCE, Indo-Scythian chieftains like Maues had established themselves in former Indo-Greek territories, and the last Greek pockets in India were gradually conquered or assimilated over the next decades. Classical sources lament the disappearance of Bactria, the ornament of Ariana, conquered by nomads, and excavations at sites like Ai-Khanoum show a sudden destruction and abandonment around this time. But Greek Bactria's fall paved the way for new hybrid cultures. The Indo-Scythian ruler Aziz is particularly significant, widely associated with major consolidation in the northwest. The Yuezhi, who had settled in the Oxus region, would in time form the nucleus of the Kushan Empire, and the Sakas, who moved into Sakistan and Punjab, would integrate their Indo-Scythian kingdoms into Iranian and Indian society. The Parthian Empire had to contend with the same nomadic pressures on its eastern frontiers, while juggling consolidation of its western gains. The Seleucids, in an attempt to reverse Parthian expansion, made one last great effort. Antiochus VII Sidetes campaigned deep into Parthian territory, but was defeated and killed, ending all Seleucid ambitions in the east. The Parthians were then able to focus on the nomadic incursions. During the reign of Mithridates II, the Parthians battled Saka tribes moving into eastern Iran. Mithridates earned the title King of Kings and the epithet of the Great, defeating the Saka in the province of Drangiana, and reasserted control over that region, which became known as Land of the Saka, or Sakistan. After expelling or subjugating many Sakas, Parthian kings employed some of them as cavalry in their own armies. By subduing these nomads, Mithridates extended Parthian dominion to the borders of Bactria and the Indo-Iranian frontier by around 100 BCE. It was also during Mithridates' era that diplomacy with Han China began. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Chinese envoy Zhang Qian reached Fergana and learned of Parthia, known to them as Anxi, describing it as a wealthy empire on China's western horizon. Soon, Silk Road trade opened. Chinese silk reached Parthian territories, and Parthia became a middleman between China and the Mediterranean. East-west contact would only grow, but Parthia's first concern remained its western frontier, where a new rival was stirring. In the late 1st century BCE, Rome expanded into the Near East, and clashes with Parthia became inevitable. In 53 BCE, the Roman triumvir Crassus led a massive army into Mesopotamia, seeking glory and wealth at Parthia's expense. But the result was disastrous for him. At the Battle of Carrhae, Parthian sparbed, General Surena, annihilated Crassus's legions with waves of horse archers and armoured cavalry, using the infamous Parthian shot to devastating effect, shooting arrows while feigning retreat. Crassus was killed, and his army's golden aquilae, his eagle standards, were captured, a humiliation that resounded in Rome. Parthia's victory at Carrhae cemented its reputation as the only Eastern power capable of withstanding Rome's might. The Roman-Parthian rivalry had begun. By 50 BCE, after capturing the buffer state of Armenia, the Sasanian Parthian Empire reigned over a vast realm from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush, governing a patchwork of provinces and vassal kingdoms with a comparatively loose, federative system. The empire's strength lay in cavalry warfare, their swift horse archers and heavily armoured cataphracts, and in the strategic use of semi-autonomous local kings who paid homage to Ctesiphon. To fully understand the resilience of the Parthian state, one must look beyond the King of Kings to the unique structure of Sassanid power, the 7 great houses of Iran. Unlike the centralized Roman Empire, or the Achaemenids before them, Parthia operated as a feudal confederacy. Foremost among these were the House of Suren and the House of Karen. The Suren family, based in Sistan, held the hereditary right to place the crown on the king's head during coronations and commanded vast private armies. It was the General Surena from this very house who defeated Crassus at Carrhae, not the king himself. This decentralization was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made the empire nearly impossible to conquer from the outside. If Rome captured an important city, the great houses would simply retreat to their strongholds and counterattack. On the other hand, these powerful nobles often acted as kingmakers, deposing monarchs who displeased them, leading to the frequent dynastic fratricide that plagued the empire's later years. Despite this, Parthia remained culturally pluralistic. Greek remained an administrative and court language in the early centuries, while Parthian, probably related to the Median, persisted among the ruling class. A famous anecdote describes Parthian nobles at a banquet reclining on golden couches while their horseback grooms stood guard, illustrating a mix of nomadic steppe heritage and Persian opulence. In the last decades of the Roman Republic, Rome and Parthia jockeyed for influence over the buffer state of Armenia. In 40 BCE, during Rome's civil wars, Parthian prince Pacorus I seized the opportunity to invade Roman territories. Parthian forces overran Syria and even entered Judea, installing client rulers opposed to Rome. But this incursion was checked by Mark Antony's lieutenant, Ventidius, who defeated and killed Pacorus in 38 BCE. Antony himself led a grand invasion of Parthia in 36 BCE, but it ended in failure, and a stalemate ensued. Finally, under Augustus Caesar, a diplomatic resolution was reached. In 20 BCE, the Parthian king Phraates IV returned the captured Roman eagles of Crassus to Augustus, a public relations triumph for Rome and a symbol of peace. Augustus even received Phraates' own sons as hostages to ensure good behavior, while sending an Italian concubine, Musa, who became a queen at the Parthian court. Classical Roman writers, though often hostile in tone, acknowledged Parthia as Rome's equal in the east. The key long-term settlement for Armenia came after the Roman-Parthian War of 58 to 63. The compromise, often labelled the Peace of Rhandaea, accepted an Arsacid prince as king of Armenia, but required that he receive the crown from the Roman emperor. Tiridates' coronation in Rome by Emperor Nero symbolized this balance, which held uneasily for decades and set the pattern for future Roman-Iranian contests over Armenia. Meanwhile, in the lands to the east, Parthian authority was more tenuous. Eastern Iran and the Indus periphery were governed by local dynasts who often struck out on their own. One such was Gondophares, a Parthian prince who in 19 CE declared independence and founded the Indo-Parthian kingdom. Centered in Arachosia and Gandhara, Gondophares took the title King of Kings and ruled a domain that had once been under Parthian and Indo-Scythian sway. Coins of Gondophares portray the king on horseback with Greek goddess Nike crowning him, and legends in both Greek and Kharoshthi script. Gondophares also entered later Christian legend. The apocryphal Acts of Thomas mentions a King Gudnafar in India, who receives the Apostle Thomas, and scholars generally identify Gudnafar with Gondophares, suggesting that the Indo-Parthian realm had early contacts with nascent Christianity. While Gondophares' dynasty did not last long, fragmenting after his death around 46 CE, it set the stage for another power rising from the north, the Kushans. Far to the northeast, the Yuezhi tribes that had conquered Bactria were coalescing. In the mid-1st century, a charismatic leader, Kujula Kadphises, united the Yuezhi's 5 clans into a single polity. He took the title of Kushan king and established authority over Bactria and the Kabul Basin, founding the Kushan Empire. The Kushans quickly swept up remnants of the Indo-Greek and Indo-Scythian states. Vima Kadphises, Kujula's grandson, consolidated the gains and struck abundant gold coins. By the end of the century, the Kushan domain encompassed all of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and part of northern India, a true Indo-Iranian empire rivaling the Parthians in scale. On the northern frontier, the Kushans even gained control of the caravan cities of Sogdia and trade routes toward China. The Kushans sat at the fulcrum of all trade in the Old World and meant to keep it that way. By the early 2nd century, the Kushan Empire had reached its zenith under Emperor Kanishka the Great. Kanishka's realm stretched from the Oxus Valley across the Hindu Kush over the Gangetic Plain and northward into the Tarim Basin. He and his predecessors established twin capital cities, one for the summer and one for winter. One extraordinary archaeological find, the Begram hoard from a Kushan summer palace in Afghanistan, contained objects from across the known world. Delicate Roman glassware, polished Chinese lacquer boxes, and carved Indian ivory panels. These treasures, cached together, suggest that merchants from as far as Alexandria and Xi'an converged at the Kushan court, bringing luxury goods that the Kushan elite eagerly acquired. At the same time, goods produced in Kushan domains, like finely crafted Bactrian goldwork or woven textiles, traveled west and east. Indian spices, Afghan lapis lazuli, Chinese silks, all coursed along the Silk Roads with Kushan caravans, and the Kushan benefited immensely from the resulting commerce. The Kushans themselves, originally steppe nomads, rapidly adopted aspects of settled civilization. They used the Greek alphabet, modified for the Bactrian language, on their coins and inscriptions. The Rabatak inscription of Kanishka, for example, is written in the Eastern Iranian language of Bactrian, but in Greek script, and it proudly lists the king's lineage and conquests in India, bridging all 3 worlds in one text. On Kushan coinage, one finds an astonishing pantheon. Greek deities, Indian gods, and Iranian gods appear. Kanishka famously issued coins depicting the Buddha with the label Bodo in Greek script, the earliest known representation of Buddha on coinage, showing the Buddha with a nimbus, styled somewhat like a Hellenistic demigod. This reflects the crucial role of Kushan patronage in the development of Mahayana Buddhism. Kanishka is credited in Buddhist tradition with convening a great Buddhist council in Kashmir, where scholars codified Buddhist scriptures. Some call this the Fourth Buddhist Council. Under Kushan rule, Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and along the Silk Road, and many Central Asian and Chinese Buddhist pilgrims of later centuries revered Kanishka's reign as a golden age of the Dharma. The art of Gandhara flourished at this time as artisans, influenced by Greek naturalism, began crafting the first anthropomorphic images of the Buddha. These Gandharan statues depicted the Buddha as a robed, Apollo-like figure with classical artistic style. An example is the standing Buddha statues found in Takhti Bahi and other Gandharan sites, which feature flowing togas and wavy hair reminiscent of Greek sculpture. Yet the mudras, the hand gestures, and iconography are distinctly Buddhist. The Kushan Empire maintained generally cordial ties with the Parthians to its west. Travelers like the Chinese monk Lokaksema translated Buddhist sutras into Chinese and carried them back to Luoyang, marking the start of Buddhist absorption into China. By 200, the unity of the Kushan Empire began to loosen. Regional governors in Bactria, in the far west and the south, started to act autonomously, along with new challengers in Iran and local powers in India, soon threatening the realm. Yet, the Kushan legacy endured in the lasting Buddhist institutions of Central Asia and the artistic heritage of Gandhara. Even nomadic elites further north were drawn into this rich world. At Tilya Tepe in northern Afghanistan, 6 first-century burials, probably of a local noble family, yielded more than 20,000 gold objects. Crowns shaped like trees, plaques with steppe animal motifs, and necklaces set with imported gems. Among the jewelry lay coins of Parthian kings, an aureus of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and local issues. While the Kushans enjoyed their efflorescence, the Parthian Empire in the 2nd century was approaching its twilight. Despite decline, it was still able to reach impressive heights, clashing mightily with Rome. A series of capable kings from the Arsacid dynasty, Osroes I, Vologases III and IV, and Artabanus IV, also called Ardavan, struggled to maintain Parthia's supremacy as they faced internal pressures alongside the intermittent Roman-Parthian wars. In 114 to 117, the Roman Emperor Trajan invaded Mesopotamia, determined to succeed where Crassus had failed. Trajan captured the Parthian capital Ctesiphon in 116 and even declared Mesopotamia a new Roman province. This was the peak of Roman advance, and coins were struck showing Trajan as Parthicus, victor over Parthia. But the triumph was short-lived. Rebellions erupted behind Roman lines. Trajan had to retreat, and after his death, his successor Hadrian relinquished Parthia's territory, preferring a stable frontier at the Euphrates. Parthia's resilience against Rome was demonstrated again in the Roman-Parthian Wars of 161 to 166, when Vologases IV invaded Armenia and Syria, prompting the co-emperor Lucius Verus to counterattack. Roman legions once more took Ctesiphon and sacked it, but the devastating Antonine Plague ravaged the Roman army, forcing withdrawal. Later, the Severan era delivered another major trauma. In 190, Septimius Severus captured and sacked Ctesiphon, plundering the city and deporting tens of thousands. Before turning back due to lack of provisions, Ctesiphon was rebuilt and passed back into Parthian hands. Each time, the Parthian monarchy managed to recover, though perhaps a bit weaker and more decentralized than before. Roman historians marveled and sometimes sneered at Parthia's ability to rise from defeat unscathed, attributing it to the network of feudal lords who could reconstitute power even after the king was beaten. But with the withdrawal of the external threat, the empire's strength through feudal lords became a major weakness. The Queen Musa, the ex-slave from Italy given to Phraates, had conspired to poison her husband and briefly ruled with her son around the dawn of the 1st century. Before being deposed themselves, regional governors acted increasingly like independent princes. Armenia, Adiabene, Karesine, and other peripheral kingdoms became semi-independent vassals that could play Rome and Parthia against each other. Economically, Parthia had grown rich from trade, and much wealth stayed in the hands of these local rulers. Parthia, in its twilight, was still a significant world power and a conduit of culture. Hellenistic influence persisted in art, and statues and temple reliefs show a mix of Greek and Mesopotamian styles, but with a curious Parthian twist. Figures are often carved frontally, staring outward, a distinctive artistic convention of the Parthian era. In religion, the Parthians tolerated Greek cults, Babylonian astrology, Judaism, early Christianity, and the worship of local Iranian gods. Persian literature and oral traditions of later times, like the Shahnameh, preserve only faint memories of the Seleucids and Parthians, often compressing them into a list of shadowy kings, in part because much of their history was recorded by Greek and Latin writers rather than in Persian chronicles. Yet on the ground, Hellenistic art and science took root in places like Iconium, while Iranian and Indian spiritual ideas flowed westward. The cult of Mithras, which became popular in the Roman Empire, likely grew out of an Iranian god's worship during Parthian times. And Buddhism, carried by Kushan monks, would travel to China and beyond. But the fall of the Arsacid Empire came swiftly in the early 3rd century. In the region of Persis, a vassal kingdom under Parthian suzerainty, a local Persian prince rose in rebellion. Ardashir, son of Papak, who claimed descent from the legendary Achaemenids. Ardashir had been consolidating his power, and by defeating neighbouring kings, he gained enough might to challenge his Parthian overlord Artaban or Artabanus IV. The two met at the Battle of Hormozgan in 224. Ardashir won a decisive victory. King Artabanus V was killed in battle. With this, the 500-year-old Arsacid dynasty crumbled. Ardashir entered Ctesiphon and was crowned Shah-Anshah of Iran, founding the Sasanian Empire, named after his ancestor Sasan, which heralded a renaissance of Persian power. Later Iranian tradition, preserved in Middle Persian texts and in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, portrays the Arsacids as weak and foreign-tainted, and Ardashir as a restorer of true Persian rule. The Parthians are portrayed as having grown weak and un-Iranian in their ways, making way for a revival of true Persian kingship under Ardashir. In reality, Ardashir's victory was not just due to nationalist fervour, but to the structural weaknesses of Parthian rule and the support of many disaffected nobles. By 226, Ardashir had executed the last Arsacid pretenders and firmly established the Sassanid dynasty. Persia reborn. On the famous rock relief carved into the cliffs of Naqsh-i-Rostam, the Sasanian king, Shapur I, is depicted on horseback as Rome kneels before him in submission. Emperor Valerian stands as a prisoner, the only Roman emperor in history captured alive. To understand how Persia reached this glorious moment, we go back to 224, when a rebel lit the spark of imperial ambition. The revolution that would reshape Asia began in a temple. The province of Persis, protected by the Zagros Mountains, had always maintained a distinct identity within the Parthian Empire. It was the ancient homeland of the Achaemenids, and the memory of that lost golden age persisted in the local aristocracy. Ardashir, the architect of the new order, was born into this atmosphere of nostalgic piety. His father, Papak, was the warden of the fire temple of Anahita at Staxa, a sacred site where the goddess of water and fertility was venerated alongside the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda. This priestly background is the key to understanding the Sasanian project. Unlike the Hellenized and tolerant Parthians, Ardashir and his followers were driven by a rigid revivalist Zoroastrian ideology. They viewed the Arsacids as weak, illegitimate usurpers who had allowed Iran's sacred flame to dim. Around 206, while the Parthian Empire was distracted by dynastic civil wars between Vologases VI and Artabanus IV, Papak and Ardashir began to quietly consolidate power in Persis. They overthrew the local petty kings, the Bazrangids, and unified the province. When Papak died, Ardashir succeeded him, quickly eliminating his own brothers to secure sole authority. By 212, Ardashir had crowned himself king of Persis, sending a shockwave of defiance toward the Parthian capital. But Ardashir's first major campaigns were directed toward the south and east, not the Parthian capital. He marched into Kerman, defeating the local ruler Balash, and installed his own son, also named Ardashir, as the governor with the title Kermanshah. He then turned north to Spahan, modern-day Isfahan, defeating and killing its governor, Shah Shapur. From there, he swept into Susiana, killing the governor of Susa and constructing a new royal city, Ardashirquara, the glory of Ardashir. This city was built on a circular plan, a deliberate architectural rejection of the rectangular Hellenistic grid, symbolizing the cosmic order of the new Iranian state. These aggressive moves forced the hand of the Parthian great king. Artabanus, preoccupied with his brother's rival claim to the throne, had initially ignored the Kurdish shepherd, as he derisively called Ardashir, but by 224 CE, the threat was existential. Artabanus summoned the feudal levies of the empire and marched south to crush the rebellion. The collision occurred on the plains of Hormozgan on April 28, 224. It was a battle of contrasting styles and eras. The Parthian army relied on the cataphract, the heavily armoured knight fighting in a loose feudal formation. Ardashir's forces, while also utilising heavy cavalry, were organised into a more cohesive, religiously motivated corps, using flexible chain armour similar to Roman designs, which offered better mobility than the Parthian lamella plates. The battle was fierce but decisive. Ardashir personally engaged Artabanus in combat and killed him. The death of the great king shattered the Parthian resistance. As Artabanus fell, so did the 500-year-old Arsacid dynasty. Ardashir assumed the title King of Kings of Iran, marking the official birth of the Sasanian Empire. With the heartland secured, Ardashir turned his gaze to the eastern horizons. The legitimacy of his new dynasty depended on controlling the totality of the Iranian cultural sphere, the entire land of Erenshah, which extended far beyond the political borders of the late Parthian state. According to the historian Al-Tabari, Ardashir led campaigns into Sakistan, Gorgan, Merv, Balkh, and Khwarezm in 233. The brutality of these campaigns was calculated. In Merv, a key Silk Road node in modern Turkmenistan, Ardashir reportedly sent the heads of his slain enemies to the fire temple of Anahita, a gruesome consecration of his victory. Envoys arrived from the kings of Kushan, Turan, and Makran, the coastal strip of Pakistan. These submissions were likely nominal tributes at this early stage, but signalled the beginning of the end for independent rule in these eastern reaches. Ardashir had laid the foundation, but it would be his son who truly built the House of Sasan. Ardashir I, mindful of the succession crises that had plagued the Parthians, crowned his son Shapur as co-ruler in 240. When Ardashir died in 242, the transition was seamless. Shapur I was a man of immense intellect and boundless ambition, styling himself not merely as King of Kings of Iran, but as Shah and Shan Iran ud An Iran, King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran. This expansion of the royal title reflected his aggressive foreign policy. He didn't just want Iran. He wanted the annexation of the Kushan territories in the east and the Roman territories in the west. While Western history remembers Shapur I primarily for his wars against Rome and the unprecedented capture of Emperor Valerian at Edessa in 260, his campaigns in the east were arguably more transformative. Early in his reign, Shapur launched a definitive invasion of the Kushan Empire. The Kushans, weakened by internal fragmentation, crumbled before the Sasanian advance. Shapur's forces pushed across the Hindu Kush, seizing the ancient capitals of Bactria, Gandhara, and the wealthy trading cities of the Indus Valley. The extent of this conquest is immortalized in Shapur's great trilingual inscription at the Kabaye Zartosht in Naqsh-e-Rostam. In this stone manifesto, Shapur lists the provinces of his empire. The document is crucial as it confirms that by 262, the Sasanian Empire had swallowed the western half of the Kushan realm. Kushan was now a province of Iran. Sasanian political influence, if not direct military administration, extended to the Tarim Basin, placing the Sasanians in control of the central nodes of the Silk Road. Shapur I recognized that the vast, wealthy, and culturally distinct lands of the east could not be ruled directly from Ctesiphon. The distance was too great and the local traditions too strong. Instead, he created a unique vice-regency. He appointed members of the Sasanian royal family, the Princes of the Blood, to govern these territories with the prestigious title of Kushan Shah, or King of the Kushans. The Kushan Shahs were basically kings in all but name, with more power than mere governors, and held a court that rivaled the imperial center in splendor. Ardashir Kushan Shah was likely the first of these ruler-governors. He began the practice of minting coins that blended Sasanian and Kushan motifs, a numismatic tradition that would continue for a century. He was followed by Peroz Kushan Shah, a ruler of immense energy who expanded the Kushano-Sasanian domain further east, pushing the remnants of the independent Kushan dynasty into Mathura in northern India. Peroz's coins have been found as far afield as Taxila and Begram, attesting to a prosperous and semi-autonomous realm that acted as the empire's eastern shield. The administration of the Kushan Shahs was a fascinating hybrid. While the governors were Sasanian princes, the bureaucracy remained largely local. The administrative language shifted from the Greek Bactrian of the Kushans to Middle Persian, but Bactrian remained in use for local affairs. The most tangible evidence of this synthesis is found in the coinage. The Kushan Shahs issued gold dinars and copper drachms that are masterpieces of syncretic art, Sasanian princes ruling as Indian kings. Into this religious ferment stepped Mani, the prophet of light. Mani viewed the Sasanian Empire as the vehicle for a universal religion that could unite Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Recognizing the spiritual importance of the East, Mani undertook a missionary journey to Turan in India around 240. In Turan, Mani achieved a diplomatic and spiritual coup. He met with the Turan Shah, or the local ruler who was likely a vassal of the Kushans or Sasanians. According to Manichaean texts, Mani displayed such spiritual power, including even levitation, that the Turan Shah converted to the new faith. "You are the Buddha of light," the king is reported to have said. This conversion gave Manichaeism a crucial foothold in the Eastern Iranian world for centuries. In 272, the death of Shapur I removed the strong hand that had bound the empire together. His successors were weaker men, dominated by the powerful clergy. Hormizd I reigned for only a year. Bahram I, Shapur's eldest son, but not his chosen heir, ascended the throne with the backing of the high priest Kartir. Bahram's reign marked a turning point in religious policy. Under pressure from Kartir, he abandoned the tolerance of his father. In 274, Mani was summoned to the court, imprisoned, and eventually executed. This act signaled the ascendancy of the Zoroastrian Orthodox faith as a pillar of the state. The tension between the orthodox, centralized court in Ctesiphon and the wealthy, syncretic viceroyalties in the east finally exploded during the reign of Bahram II. The Kushan Shahs, controlling the lucrative Silk Road trade and commanding battle-hardened armies on the frontier, began to see themselves as rivals to the Sassanid court. Hormizd Kushan Shah, the governor of the east and perhaps Bahram's brother, launched an open rebellion to establish an independent state. Hormizd assumed the title Kushan Shahan Shah, the king of kings of the Kushans, a direct affront to the Sasanian monarch. In the eyes of the East, he was the true king of kings. He was supported in this rebellion by the Sakan Shah, ruler of Sakastan, and other eastern nobles. The scale of this rebellion was catastrophic for Bahram. It forced him to strip the western frontier of troops to march east. The Roman Emperor Cyrus seized this opportunity in 283, marching down the Euphrates and sacking Ctesiphon virtually unopposed. The Sasanian Empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Only the sudden, mysterious death of Cyrus, allegedly struck by lightning, saved the dynasty. The Romans withdrew, allowing Bahram to finally turn his full attention to the east and contain the Kushan Shahs. Bahram II died in 293, leaving the throne to his son Bahra III, known as the Sakan Shah. But the young king was weak and lacked the support of the nobility. His great-uncle Narseh, the last surviving son of Shapur I and a veteran general himself, saw his chance. From his power base in Armenia, Narseh marched on Ctesiphon. The story of this civil war is recorded in the Paikuli inscription, a massive bilingual text carved onto a tower in the Zagros Mountains. The inscription describes how the grandees of the empire flocked to Narseh's banner, rejecting the boy king Bahram. The list of Narseh's supporters includes the Kushan Shah in the east. It appears that Hormizd Kushan Shah, who had rebelled against his brother Bahram II, now threw his support behind Narseh. The young Bahram III was deposed after only 4 months, and Narseh took the crown. Narseh's reign was a period of retrenchment. In the west, he suffered a humiliating defeat against the Roman Caesar Galerius, leading to the Treaty of Nisibis in 299. This treaty ceded 5 provinces across the Tigris to Rome and established Roman dominance over Armenia. At least in the east, Narseh maintained a stable status quo. The Kushan Shahs remained loyal vassals, but their autonomy was evident. Narseh's son and successor, Hormizd II, continued this policy of engagement. He is believed to have married a Kushan princess, Ifra Hormizd, a dynastic union intended to bind the restless eastern province closer to the royal house. Hormizd's reign was marked by passivity, though he did engage in a border war with the Ghassanid Arabs in Syria, where he was killed in 309 while hunting in the desert, an event that would trigger the greatest crisis of the early Sasanian era. The death of Hormizd left the empire leaderless and vulnerable. The Sasanian high nobility and clergy, fearing the rise of another strong autocrat, decided to brutally prune the royal family tree. They executed Hormizd's eldest son, Ador-Narseh, blinded the second son, and imprisoned the third, Prince Hormizd. In a desperate bid to retain control, the nobles turned to Hormizd's pregnant wife, Ifra Hormizd. In a ceremony that blended legend with political necessity, the crown of the King of Kings was reportedly placed upon the queen's womb. The child she carried was declared king before he drew his first breath. This child was Shapur II. For the first 16 years of Shapur II's life, the Sasanian Empire was effectively a republic of nobles. The Queen Mother, Ifra Hormizd, ruled as regent with the support of the grandees, but central authority withered. In this vacuum, the enemies of Iran struck. Arab tribes from the peninsula, the Iyad, Taghlib, and Banu Bakr, crossed the Persian Gulf in fleets of doors. They raided the province of Fars, the very heartland of the dynasty, plundering cities and desecrating fire temples. The Sasanian army, paralyzed by the lack of a royal commander, could do little to stop them. In the east, the authority of Ctesiphon evaporated completely. The Kushan Shahs, specifically Peroz II Kushan Shah, operated with near total independence. They issued coinage in Gandhara, featuring the distinctive bullhorn's crown, signalling a distinct royal identity separate from the West. But without the backing of the imperial army, the Kushan Shahs began to lose ground to local chieftains and the early pressure of a new menace: the nomadic migrations from the north. In 325, Shapur II reached the age of 16. He immediately took command of the army and launched a campaign of vengeance against the Arab tribes that had ravaged his homeland. The campaign was swift and brutal. Shapur's forces destroyed the naval capability of the Arab tribes and then crossed the Gulf and marched deep into the Arabian Peninsula, carrying the war to the oases of the Nejd and perhaps as far as Medina. To ensure they could never bear arms again, Shapur reportedly ordered the shoulders of the captive warriors to be pierced and threaded with ropes. This earned him the Arabic epithet Du al-Aktaf, he of the shoulders. He forcibly deported entire tribes, moving the Banu Taghlib to Kerman and the Banu Bakr to the borders of Khuzestan, using them as living buffers. To secure the frontier, he constructed the War-i-Tazigan, the Wall of the Arabs. With the Arabs crushed and his authority absolute, Shapur II turned his eyes to the east. he was determined to end the anomaly of the semi-independent Kushan Shahs. Around 330 to 335, Shapur launched a campaign to reintegrate them into the direct administration of the empire. The details of this war are lost, but the numismatic evidence tells the story clearly. The coinage of the Kushan Shahs in Gandhara and Kabul ceases abruptly. In its place, we find silver drachms minted in Kabul, bearing the image of Shapur and the imperial title. Perot's Kushan Shah was likely deposed or reduced to a mere figurehead. The Kushan Shah was no longer a vassal kingdom, but a province under the direct rule of the King of Kings. Shapur needed the wealth of the Silk Road and the manpower of the Martial Eastern tribes to fuel his renewed war against Rome. By 340, Sasanian governors were sitting in Balkh, Herat and Peshawar. But Shapur's victory in the east was destined to be challenged by a force far more dangerous than the Kushan Shahs. Around 350, a new wave of nomadic invaders appeared on the banks of the Oxus River. These were the Chionites, a Hunnish confederation of immense ferocity. The arrival of the Chionites forced Shapur to abandon his siege of the Roman fortress of Nisibis and rush his army 2,000 miles to the east. The war that followed was grueling. Shapur fought in the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the deserts of Turan, struggling to contain the mobile Chionite cavalry. Unlike previous Sasanian kings who sought total conquest, Shapur II showed his pragmatic genius. Realizing he could not fully defeat the Chionites, he engaged in diplomacy. He forged an alliance with the Chionite king, Grumbates. In a remarkable turn of events, the enemies became allies. The Chionites agreed to serve as auxiliaries in the Sasanian army. By 358, the eastern frontier was stabilized by treaty. In 359, Shapur II launched his great invasion of Roman Mesopotamia, aiming to recapture the fortress city of Amida. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was present in the besieged city, gives us a vivid eyewitness account of the Chionite allies. He describes Grumbates as a king of middle age and wrinkled limbs, but of a grand spirit and already famous for many victories. At the siege, tragedy struck the alliance when Grumbates' son was killed by a Roman ballista bolt. The Chionites, enraged by the death of their prince, demanded immediate vengeance. Shapur was forced to abandon his plan of bypassing the city, and instead committed his army to a brutal, grinding siege. The fall of Amida was a bloodbath, but it cemented the bond between Shapur and his eastern allies. The Chionites had bled for the King of Kings, and in return, they were likely granted free rein to settle in the lands north of the Oxus, acting as a buffer against further nomadic waves. The Roman response came 4 years later, led by Emperor Julian the Apostate. Julian, dreaming of emulating Alexander the Great, launched a massive invasion of the Sasanian heartland in 363. He marched down the Euphrates with a fleet of over 1,000 ships, reaching the walls of Ctesiphon. Shapur, adopting a scorched earth policy, allowed Julian to overextend himself. The Roman army, though victorious in the Battle of Ctesiphon, found itself trapped, unable to take the fortified capital, and was running out of supplies in the burning heat of the Mesopotamian summer. Julian made the fatal decision to burn his fleet and march inland, hoping to force a decisive battle. Shapur's gambit paid off. Harried by Sasanian Savaran heavy cavalry and their Arab allies, the Roman retreat turned into a death march. Julian was mortally wounded by a spear in a skirmish, dying in 363. His successor Jovian, trapped and desperate, agreed to a humiliating peace treaty. Rome ceded the 5 provinces across the Tigris, acquired from Narse, along with their impregnable fortress of Nisibis. This victory was the zenith of Shapur II's reign. He had defeated Rome, secured his western border, and integrated the eastern nomads into his war machine. But Shapur's preoccupation with Rome had a cost. Around 360 to 370, a new dynastic group known as the Kidarites began to assert control over Bactria. The Kidarites were likely a specific clan or political formation within the broader Chionite confederation. Led by their king Kidara, they moved south from the Oxus, occupying the old Kushan lands of Bactria. Like the earlier Kushan Shahs who were Sasanian viceroys, Kidara was an independent sovereign. Shapur II, now aging and exhausted by his western wars, seems to have been unable to prevent this usurpation. The Kushan Shah that Shapur I had conquered a century earlier was now the Kidarite kingdom. The Sasanians lost direct control of the Silk Road trade through Afghanistan, and the Kidarites, styling themselves as restorers of the Kushan Empire, became the new gatekeepers of India. Shapur II died in 379, leaving an empire that was secure in the west but fraying in the east. He was succeeded by his brother, Ardashir II. An elderly man who had served as the king of Adiabene, Ardashir attempted to continue Shapur's strong centralizing policies. But the Sasanian nobility, suppressed for 70 years under the iron fist of Shapur II, was eager to regain its privileges. So Ardashir's short reign was consumed by internal strife. He is remembered in some sources as the beneficent, likely for tax exemptions granted to the poor. But the nobility viewed him as a tyrant. In 383, he was deposed and killed by the grandees, a pattern of regicide that would plague the dynasty for decades. Shapur III, son of Shapur II, ascended a shaky throne. His reign is most notable for the Peace of Asilacene in 387, which partitioned the troublesome kingdom of Armenia between Rome and Iran. This partition effectively ended Armenia as an independent buffer state, turning it into a Sasanian province ruled by governors called Marzbands. But while Shapur III secured Armenia, he lost Kabul in the east. It was during his reign that another wave of Huns, the Alkon, crossed the Hindu Kush. Distinct from the Kidarites in Bactria, the Alkons pushed into the Kabul Valley. Numismatic evidence shows Alkon kings overstriking the coins of Shapur III in Kabul, a clear sign of conquest. Shapur died in 388, reportedly when the cords of his royal tent were cut by conspirators, crushing him beneath the heavy canvas. It was called a hunting accident. He was succeeded by Bahram IV, known as Kermanshah. In 395, a Hunnic army led by chieftains Basik and Kursik bypassed Sasanian defences. Bahram managed to defeat one of the Hunnic detachments and recover much of the booty. But the psychological damage was done. The empire now faced a threat that could strike from the north as well as the east. The nobility was also done with his weak king. In 399, he was shot by an arrow during a hunting expedition, another suspicious accident that cleared the way for a new kind of king. This was Yazdegerd I. He was determined to break the cycle of noble dominance. A ruler of high intelligence and iron will, his policies earned him two very different epithets. To his Christian and Jewish subjects, he was a second Cyrus the Great. But to the Zoroastrian clergy and nobility, he was Yazdegerd the Sinner. This was because of Yazdegerd's strategy of counterbalancing the power of the Zoroastrian aristocracy by patronizing the empire's religious minorities. He halted the persecution of Christians and maintained excellent relations with the Roman Empire. In a gesture of extraordinary trust, the dying Roman Emperor Arcadius appointed Yazdegerd I as the guardian of his infant son, Theodosius II. The most enduring legacy of Yazdegerd's reign was the institutionalization of Christianity in Iran. In 410, he convened a council of bishops at the capital. Under the guidance of the Roman envoy, Marutha of Mephikat, and the Sasanian bishop Isaac, the council formally organized the Church of the East. The Church adopted the Nicene Creed, but asserted its administrative independence from Rome to avoid accusations of being a Roman fifth column. This act integrated the Christian community into the Sasanian state structure, turning them from a persecuted minority into a protected class loyal to the Eastern Empire. But it was his internal war against the nobility that eventually cost him his life. In 420, while staying at the brink of the Chishmehi Sabs, Green Spring, near Tus in the northeast, Yazdegerd died under mysterious circumstances. The official court chronicle, written by his enemies, claims that a magnificent white horse emerged from the spring, kicked the king to death, and then vanished back into the waters. This fable of divine retribution thinly veiled a political assassination. Most likely the nobles, weary of a king who protected Christians and ignored their privileges, had murdered him in the remote northeast. But the seeds of Sasanian resilience were deep, and Yazdegerd's son, Bahram V, would soon arrive from the Arab desert to claim his birthright and begin one of the most romanticized reigns in Persian history. The powerful Wuzagan and Maubeds, the nobility and priesthood, moved swiftly to disinherit Yazdegerd's sons, fearing a continuation of his centralizing and religiously tolerant policies. They bypassed the legitimate heirs and installed a puppet ruler, Khosrow, a descendant of Bahram IV, on the throne in Ctesiphon. But Bahram was not easily marginalized. He had been raised in the Arab vassal kingdom of the Lakhmids at Al-Hira, a strategic decision by his father to secure a loyal base of support outside the intricate and treacherous politics of the capital. Under the tutelage of the Lakhmid king Al-Numan, and subsequently supported by his son Al-Mundir, Bahram had absorbed the martial and equestrian traditions of the Arab court. Upon receiving news of the coup in Ctesiphon, Bahram mobilized a formidable coalition from his Arab foster family. Al-Mundir provided him with a substantial army of Arab cavalry and heavy infantry, with which Bahram marched on the capital. The Shahnameh and other traditions recount the trial of the lions, wherein Bahram challenged the usurper Khosrow to retrieve the royal crown from between two lions. While Khosrow demurred, Bahram slew the beasts and claimed the diadem. Bahram V was crowned in 421, but in a significant break from tradition, as a concession to the religious class, he was crowned by the Mobaden Mobed, the chief priest, rather than a secular noble. This act signalled a restoration of the alliance between the crown and the altar. To appease the Zoroastrian clergy who had detested his father, Bahram initiated a systematic persecution of Christians, as some had attacked Zoroastrian temples. This internal repression triggered a refugee crisis, as high-ranking Persian Christians fled to Roman territory. Roman Emperor Theodosius II refused to surrender these refugees, the casus belli for the War of 421. Following a stalemate in Mesopotamia, the Roman general Ardaburius laid siege to Nisibis and invaded Arsinoe. But the Sasanian defense, organized by the astute Grand Minister Mir Narseh, prevented a Roman breakthrough. The war concluded with the Peace of 422. The Sasanian Empire agreed to tolerate its Christian subjects, while Rome agreed to tolerate Zoroastrians within its borders. The treaty also stipulated that Rome would contribute financially to the defense of the Caucasus passes, acknowledging that the Sasanian defense against the Huns served the security interests of both empires. While the Western Front stabilized, the eastern frontier disintegrated. The Kidarites crossed the Oxus River in force. They seized the oasis city of Merv, a critical node on the Silk Road and the gateway to the Iranian plateau. Bahram's response to this invasion cemented his reputation as a warrior king. In 427, masking his movements under the guise of a hunting expedition, he led a select force of cavalry via the southern Caspian coast and Hyrcania to catch the nomads unaware. The resulting Battle of Merv was a crushing Sasanian victory. The Kidarite king was killed, his wife captured, and their army scattered. To monumentalize this victory, Bahram erected a tower or pillar on the banks of the Oxus River. It demarcated the eternal boundary between what they viewed Iran, the civilized land, and Turan, the chaotic lands of the nomads. Internally, Bahram V's reign is often remembered as a golden age of prosperity and cultural flourishing, earning him the sobriquet Bahram Gur, or Bahram of the Onager, for his legendary hunting prowess. He delegated much of the day-to-day administration to his capable Grand Minister, allowing the king to cultivate an image of chivalric accessibility. His patronage of the arts had lasting demographic consequences. Tradition holds that Bahram requested thousands of musicians and entertainers from India, but once settled, they began squandering provisions and were expelled to become a wandering people, a legendary Persian origin of the Romani people. Upon the death of Bahram in 438, his son Yazdegerd II ascended the throne. His reign marked a stark departure from the laissez-faire charisma of his father. Yazdegerd was a stern administrator and a religious zealot who viewed the unification of the empire's disparate peoples under Zoroastrianism as a prerequisite for national survival in the face of the growing Hunnic threat. The Kidarites, despite their defeat at Merv, remained a potent force. They controlled the rich lands of Tokaristan, the contemporary label for Bactria, and Gandhara, and they had even begun to extract tribute from the Sasanians, a humiliation that Yazdegerd II was determined to end. Recognizing that the war required his undivided attention, Yazdegerd took the radical step of transferring his court from Ctesiphon to Nishapur in the province of Abashar in Khorasan in 453. From this base, he launched annual campaigns against the Kidarites. After years of grinding warfare, Yazdegerd launched a massive offensive in 450. Sasanian forces penetrated deep into Kidarite territory, capturing fortresses and forcing the enemy to retreat across the Oxus. While this did not destroy the Kidarite kingdom, it temporarily secured the frontier. Yazdegerd II's obsession with security and centralization had a darker side in the west. He viewed the Christian Nakaras of Armenia as potential traitors allied with Rome. In 449, he issued an edict demanding that the Armenian nobility convert to Zoroastrianism. This was an attempt to both integrate the region religiously, but also to integrate the feudal Armenian cavalry, some of the finest in the world, fully into the Sasanian military apparatus without the risk of divided loyalties. The edict provoked a massive national uprising led by the Sparapet, the commander-in-chief Vardan Mamikonian. The rebels seized control of Artashat and appealed to Byzantium for aid, which never materialized. Yazdegerd responded by dispatching a massive army, including the elite Savaran and war elephants, to crush the revolt. The opposing forces met on the Avarir plain on May 26, 451. The engagement was brutal. The Armenian heavy cavalry, fighting for their faith and feudal rights, inflicted heavy casualties on the Persian ranks. But the sheer weight of the Sasanian numbers and the devastation caused by the elephants ultimately broke the Armenian lines, and Vardan Mamikonian was killed. Avarir was a tactical victory, but a strategic failure. The resistance didn't end with the battle, but morphed into a protracted guerrilla war that drained Sasanian resources. Yazdegerd eventually dismissed the governor and adopted a policy of reluctant toleration, though tensions remained high for decades. The death of Yazdegerd II in 457 exposed the structural weakness of the Sasanian succession. He had numerous sons, among them Hormizd III, who seized the throne in Rai, and Peroz the Younger, who fled to the northeast. But Peroz secured the backing of the local house of Mihran and perhaps a far-off Hunnic king, while the Queen Mother, Dinag, ruled as regent for Hormizd. Attempting to maintain order, Peroz marched west with his Hunnic Mihranid army. In 459, he defeated and executed Hormizd. Peroz ascended the throne as the victorious, but his victory was tainted. He had invited a foreign predator into the heart of Iranian politics, a debt that the nomadic powers would soon call in. The reign of Peroz I is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, ending with the single greatest military disaster in Sasanian history. Almost immediately after his accession, the empire was struck by a catastrophic crisis. A severe drought began in 461 and persisted for 7 years, devastating the agricultural base of the Iranian plateau. Contrary to his later reputation for recklessness, Peroz's handling of the famine was exemplary. Even while managing the famine, Peroz continued the relentless war against the Kidarites, who still posed a threat from Balkh. In a brilliant diplomatic maneuver, Peroz forged an alliance with Mehama, the ruler of the Alkan Huns, and the king of Kadag, a region in southern Bactria. The Alkan, rivals to the Kidarites, controlled the passes of the Hindu Kush and were eager to expand. According to historical accounts, Peroz, offering his sister to marry the Kidarite king, instead sent a mere slave, a gross insult. The king, Kunkas, then requested around 300 military experts from Peroz. When he sent them, they were all killed or mutilated in retaliation for the marriage ruse, sparking a final conflict. The combined Sasanian Alkan armies crushed the Kidarite forces. The Kidarite capital of Elam, or Balkh, was captured, and their power in Transoxiana was permanently broken. They were forced to flee into Gandhara, where they would eventually be absorbed by the Alkan expansion. Peroz celebrated this victory by minting special gold coinage in Balkh, asserting his title as the restorer of the East. But the destruction of the Kidarites removed a crucial buffer state. The Sasanians now stood face to face with a far more formidable confederation that was expanding westward from the Altai region. The Hephthalite Empire, the White Huns. There was already a relationship between Peroz and the Hepthalites. They were the Hunnic power which aided Peroz secure the realm from Hormizd. But the union deteriorated rapidly, likely over disputes regarding the tribute Peroz had promised for their aid in the civil war. Peroz launched 2 campaigns against the Hepthalites. In the first, his army was guided into a desert trap by a double agent, forcing him to surrender. He was ransomed only after the Byzantine Emperor Zeno contributed financial aid, a rare instance of Roman-Sasanian cooperation against a mutual threat. In the second conflict, Peroz was captured again and forced to pay a staggering ransom of 30 mule packs of silver. To guarantee the payment, his son and heir, Kavad, was left as a hostage at the Hephthalite court for 3 years. Despite these warnings, and the explicit opposition of his nobility and clergy, Peroz resolved to launch a third decisive campaign in 484. He assembled a massive army of 50 to 100,000 men, including the entire Sasanian elite, and marched towards the Hephthalite stronghold. The Hephthalite king, Kushnavas, sent envoys reminding Peroz of the peace treaty and the boundary tower erected by Bahram V. But in a display of legalistic hubris, Peroz tied the boundary tower to elephants and dragged it in front of his army, claiming he was technically not violating the border since the tower was moving with him. Kushnavas declined a direct engagement. Instead, he ordered the excavation of a massive trench across the plain, concealing it with reeds and loose earth. He then feigned a retreat. The Sasanian heavy cavalry, eager for victory, charged at full gallop. The result was humiliation and annihilation. The front ranks of the Sasanian cavalry crashed into the trench, and the rear ranks piled on top of them. In the ensuing chaos, the Hephthalite archers slaughtered the trapped Persians. Peroz was killed, and his body was never recovered. Along with him died 4 of his sons and brothers, and the majority of the Sasanian nobility. The disaster of 484 left the Sasanian Empire face down in the mud. The Hepthalites occupied the major cities of Khorasan, Herat, Merv, and Nishapur, and imposed a heavy annual tribute on the Sasanian state. The empire had effectively become a vassal of the Huns. The death of Peroz was more than a strategic failure, but a theological catastrophe for the Zoroastrian state. The Shah-Anshah was the earthly proxy of Ahura Mazda, charged with maintaining truth against the forces of the lie. For the King of Kings to fall in battle against demonic nomads, and for his body to remain unrecovered, suggested a rupture in the divine favour that underpinned the dynasty. With the monarchy decapitated, the survival of the state fell to the few remaining grandees. Shukra, a powerful nobleman from the house of Karen, emerged as the saviour of the dynasty. He mobilized his private army from Sakistan and Zabalistan and launched a counter-offensive that checked the Hephthalite advance. Shukra returned to Ctesiphon as the de facto ruler of the empire. He orchestrated the election of Balash, Peroz's brother, as the new Shah-Anshah. Balash was a mild and pliable figure, chosen essentially to legitimize Sukra's regency. The devastation in the east forced the Sasanian leadership to close the western front. The Armenian rebellion, which had reignited under Vahan Mamikonian, nephew of Vardan, could no longer be suppressed. Recognizing the need for the Armenian cavalry to rebuild the shattered imperial army, Balash sent envoys to Vahan at the village of Nvarsak. The resulting Treaty of Nvarsak was a complete capitulation to Armenian demands. Full freedom of worship was granted to Christians, and all fire altars in Armenia were to be destroyed. Conversion to Zoroastrianism was prohibited, and land could not be granted to converts. The rights of the Nakharas, the Armenian nobility, were fully restored. To seal the pact, Vahan Mamikonian was appointed Mazban of Armenia in 485. The wisdom of this policy was proven almost immediately, as when a pretender named Zara revolted against Balash, it was the Armenian cavalry under Vahan that suppressed the rebellion, capturing and executing Zara. In 488, the nobility grew weary of Balash's ineffectual rule. In accordance with Sasanian custom, he was blinded. A physical mutilation that rendered him ineligible for the throne, and replaced by his nephew, Kavad I. Kavad I ascended the throne as a teenager, perhaps only 15 years old, but he possessed a geopolitical education unlike any of his predecessors. Having spent years as a hostage at the Hephthalite court, Kavad had observed the steppe nomads. He knew they weren't faceless demons, but a sophisticated military and political power. He understood their tactics, their hierarchy, and he had built personal relationships with their leadership. The early years of Kavad's reign were dominated by the same figure who had overshadowed Balash, Sukra. This kingmaker from the house of Karen treated the young monarch as a ward rather than a sovereign. To break the stranglehold of the great families, Kavad initiated a violent purge. Around 493, he conspired with Shapur of Ray, a rival noble from the house of Mihran, to arrest and execute Sukra. While this removed the immediate threat to his person, Kavad realized that the systemic power of the nobility, rooted in their vast landholdings and hereditary privileges, couldn't be dismantled by court intrigue alone. He needed a weapon that would strike at the very foundations of the social order. He found this weapon in the radical theology of Mazdak. Around 490, a Zoroastrian priest named Mazdak-i-Bamdad began preaching a heterodox interpretation of the faith that would shake the empire to its core. Mazdakism has its roots in Gnostic dualism and Manichaean thought, but is often described by modern scholars as a form of proto-communism, the perfect weapon to take down the nobility. Mazdak taught that the universe was a battleground between light and darkness, and that the mixing of these two principles had created the material world. He identified the root causes of conflict and hatred in human society as the desire for material possessions and the exclusive hoarding of women by the nobility. To release the light and restore harmony, these sources of greed and envy must be eliminated. Therefore, all wealth and all women were to be held in common by all men. For the impoverished peasantry, devastated by the taxes of the Hephthalite tribute and a prolonged drought, Mazdak's message was almost messianic. For Kavad I, who wanted to curtail the powers of the nobles, it was a political godsend. Kavad engaged in a revolution from above. He opened the royal granaries to the people and, more controversially, sanctioned the Mazdakite seizure of noble estates and the breaking of harems. This was a calculated assault on the two pillars of noble power, their economic base, the land, and their biological continuity, the lineage. But the nobility and the Zoroastrian church, pushed to the brink of extinction, struck back. In 496, a coalition of the great houses and the high clergy deposed Kavad. The king was charged with apostasy from the true faith and the subversion of the social order. Kavad was arrested and imprisoned in the Castle of Oblivion in Khuzestan, a fortress of such sinister reputation that it was forbidden to even mention the names of those incarcerated within its walls. To replace him, the nobles installed his brother Jamasp, a mild-mannered and orthodox prince whom they believed would be a compliant puppet. The Mazdakite movement was temporarily suppressed, and the old order appeared to have been restored. But Kavad managed to escape and flee. He didn't seek refuge with the Romans, the traditional enemies of Persia, but with the very people who had killed his father, the Hephthalites. The Hephthalite king received the fugitive monarch with honor. Kavad spent 3 years at the White Hun's court. He solidified his alliance by marrying the Hephthalite king's daughter, effectively merging the bloodlines of the two dynasties. In exchange for Sasanian territorial concessions and a promise of renewed tribute, the Hephthalite king provided Kavad with an army of 30,000 cavalry to retake his throne. In 498, Kavad marched on Ctesiphon at the head of a foreign army. The nobility, seeing the Hephthalite horde and realizing that Jamasp lacked the charisma or resources to mount a defense, capitulated. Kavad entered the capital without a major battle. Jamasp was deposed. While Kavad spared his brother's life, though likely blinding him to prevent future claims, he showed no mercy to the ringleaders of the coup, and they were all purged. Now, Kavad needed money to pay his Hephthalite debt, and he needed stability to rebuild the army. The Sasanian treasury was empty. Kavad had to turn to the Byzantine Empire for liquidity. He demanded that Emperor Anastasius I pay the customary subsidies for the defense of the Caucasus passes, which Persia garrisoned to protect both empires from northern nomads. Anastasius, believing Persia to be terminally weak, refused. It was a grave miscalculation. In 502, Kavad launched a surprise invasion of Roman Armenia, initiating the Anastasian War. The centerpiece of the war was the siege of Amida. Kavad besieged the heavily fortified city for 3 months. The siege was brutal and technologically sophisticated, involving siege towers and mining operations. Eventually, the city fell to a surprise night attack. Kavad's troops sacked the city, a shock that reverberated throughout the Roman East, as Amida had not fallen to a foreign power in centuries. It is notable that Roman sources, such as Joshua the Stylite, mention the presence of Huns in Kavad's army during this campaign. These were undoubtedly his Hephthalite allies, fulfilling their treaty obligations and fighting alongside the Sasanian sovereign heavy cavalry. The war demonstrated that the Sasanian army, rebuilt by Kavad, was once again a peer competitor to Rome. The conflict ended in 506 with a truce. Anastasius agreed to pay a massive indemnity, nominally for the maintenance of the Caucasus forts, but in reality a payment to buy peace. Kavad immediately used this gold to pay off his Hephthalite creditors, securing his eastern flank. Financial affairs were finally sorted. While the Hephthalites in Bactria were pacified, the Sasanian collapse in the east under Peroz had created a power vacuum that allowed various Hunnic groups to expand. Distinct from the Hephthalites, the Alkon Huns, identified by their practice of artificial cranial deformation, pushed southeast into Gandhara and the Punjab, under their kings Toramana and the notorious Mihirakula, and the Alkons devastated the Gupta Empire, effectively ending the classical age of India. In the region of Zabulistan and Kabul, another group known as the Nezak Huns established themselves. They are famous in numismatics for their unique coins, featuring a king wearing a winged bullhead crown. The Nezaks acted as a wedge between the Sasanian sphere in Khorasan and the Alkon sphere in India. For much of Kavad's reign, the Nezaks appear to have been semi-autonomous, acknowledging Sasanian suzerainty only when forced by the Hephthalite overlords. Toward the end of his life, Kavad faced renewed hostilities with Rome, now ruled by Justin I and his nephew Justinian. The conflict, known as the Iberian War, was fought over the allegiance of the Christian kingdom of Iberia, modern Georgia. The Iberian king, Gurgen, defected to Rome to avoid forced conversion to Zoroastrianism. Kavad utilized his Arab vassal, Al-Mundir III of the Lakhmids, to harass the Roman frontier. Al-Mundir was a terrifyingly effective raider, striking deep into Syria and capturing high-value Roman commanders. As Kavad aged, the question of succession became the crux of imperial politics. He had 3 prominent sons, each representing a different faction. Kawus, the eldest, who was a fervent Mazdakite and the darling of the radical sect. Jamasp, a capable warrior and the choice of many nobles, but disqualified due to being blinded in one eye. And Khosrau, the youngest, favoured by Kavad but hated by the Mazdakites for his anti-revolutionary stance. The Mazdakites were now a powerful political faction embedded in the administration and demanded the throne for Kawus. The Orthodox clergy and the surviving nobility, terrified of a Mazdakite king, rallied behind Khosrau. Kavad in his final years made a pragmatic calculation. He realized that a Mazdakite monarchy would lead to perpetual civil war and isolation. To secure the dynasty, he had to destroy the very tool he had used to save it. In 528, Kavad and Khosrau lured the Mazdakite leadership to a feast or debate at the royal court. The event, famously dramatized in the Shahnameh, was a trap. Khosrau ordered his men to bury the Mazdakites alive in a walled garden, planting them headfirst with their legs kicking in the air. He then summoned Mazdak and invited him to view this garden, telling him, "Go and see the trees that no one has ever seen before." As Mazdak looked upon the forest of dying men, he was seized and executed, hung upside down and shot with arrows. This massacre decapitated the Mazdakite movement. Kavad died in 531, leaving the throne to Khosrau I. Khosrow, known as Anushirvan, the immortal soul, is revered in Persian history as the ideal monarch. His first act was to secure his throne by executing his brothers, Kawus and Jamasp, and all their male offspring, eliminating any rival claimants. Khosrow inherited a state that had been shaken by revolution. He used the post-Mazdakite vacuum to implement a comprehensive program of reforms that transformed the Sasanian Empire from a feudal confederation into a centralized autocracy. To do this, he revamped the kingdom's finances and military. The Karag, the land tax, was fixed based on the type of crop and the area under cultivation, providing the treasury with a predictable, stable income regardless of the harvest. The gezit, or poll tax, was a graduated head tax imposed on commoners, with exemptions for the nobility, clergy, and bureaucracy. For the military, the Sasanian army had traditionally relied on the Azadan, the great nobles who raised and equipped their own levies. These lords were often more loyal to their clan than to the king. Khosrow used his new tax revenues to create a professional standing army. He empowered a class of lesser gentry known as the Dehkans. These small landowners became the backbone of the administration and the military. The state provided them with equipment and salaries, making them directly dependent on the crown. Khosrow abolished the office of Eran Sparbed, supreme commander of the realm, a position that had allowed men like Sukra to dominate the king. In its place, it was split into 4 regional Sparbeds, each responsible for a quadrant of the empire. Secure at home, Khosrow turned his attention abroad. In 532, he signed the perpetual peace with Emperor Justinian, concluding the Iberian War. The Byzantines paid £11,000 of gold to secure their eastern flank, while they undertook a reconquest of North Africa and Italy. By 540, Khosrow grew alarmed by Justinian's successes in the west and responded to pleas from the Ostrogoths and his Armenian subjects. He broke the peace and launched a devastating invasion of Syria. Khosrow's army marched virtually unopposed to Antioch, Rome's Queen of the East and the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire. The city was sacked and burned. In a display of imperial arrogance and logistical prowess, Khosrow deported the surviving population of Antioch to Mesopotamia. Near his capital at Ctesiphon, he built a new city named Way Antioch Khosrow, Khosrow's Better Antioch, built to the exact plan of the original city. The conflict then shifted north to Lazica, today's western Georgia, a vital region that controlled access to the Black Sea. The war was a grinding stalemate fought in the difficult terrain of the Caucasus. Although the Byzantines eventually retained political control of Lazica, a peace treaty forced the Romans to subsidize Khosrow's empire through a heavy indemnity. While Khosrow battled Rome in the west, a seismic shift occurred in the steppes of the east. In 552, the Celestial Turks, better known as the Guk Turks, led by Bumin Kagan, overthrew their Ruran overlords and established the First Turkic Khaganate. By 555, the Western Turkic Khaganate, under Bumin's brother Istami, had expanded to the borders of the Hephthalite Empire. The Hephthalites, once the terror of the East, were now squeezed between a resurgent Sasanian Empire and the expanding Turks. Khosrow I recognized the opportunity to finally avenge the death of his grandfather Peroz and end the hated Hephthalite tribute. He initiated diplomatic contact with Istami. To seal an alliance against their common enemy, Khosrow married a daughter of the Turkic Khagan. Unbeknownst to Khosrow, it represented the first major diplomatic alignment between the Iranian world and the Turkic steppe, a relationship that would define the history of the Middle East for the next 1,000 years. The Allied campaign commenced around 560, and the trap was sprung. The Sasanian and Turkic armies launched a coordinated pincer attack on the Hephthalite Empire. From the north, the Turks crossed the Jaxartes. The Sasanian army, reconstituted under Khosrow's military reforms, marched northeast into Tukharistan. The Hephthalite state, weakened by internal decay and unable to fight a 2-front war, collapsed. The decisive engagement, the Battle of Golzarian around 560, saw the total defeat of the Hephthalite forces. The Sasanian army finally avenged the humiliation of 484. The victors divided the spoils of the Hephthalite Empire, establishing the Oxus River as the new frontier. This victory marked the restoration of the Sasanian Empire to its Achaemenid-era boundaries in the east. The demons that had haunted the empire for nearly a century were destroyed. The Sasanian Empire, though it would grow territorially larger, was arguably already at its peak. The army that sacked Antioch and destroyed the Hephthalites was a state instrument, disciplined and paid by the crown. But the elimination of buffer states, like the Hephthalite Empire and the Kingdom of Iberia, removed the insulation between Persia and its true rivals. By 557, Persia shared direct borders with the two strongest military powers in the world, Rome in the west and the Turks in the east. With the realm finally free and at peace, Khosrow I acted as a philosopher king in the Platonic mould. He welcomed Greek philosophers fleeing the closure of the academy in Athens in 529. His court at Ctesiphon became a crucible of cross-cultural exchange where Indian chess was introduced, and Sanskrit texts like the Panchatantra were translated into Middle Persian. Khosrow I died in 579, leaving the throne to his son, Hormizd IV. Hormizd inherited a powerful state, but lacked his father's political acumen. His reign is described in the sources as one of benevolent tyranny, noted for his justice toward the common people, but his extreme harshness toward the nobility and the Zoroastrian clergy. Hormizd's mother was a Turkic princess, earning him the derogatory epithet the Turk among the racially conscious Persian aristocracy. Fearful of the power of the great houses, Hormizd engaged in a systematic purge, reportedly executing thousands of nobles and priests. But this left Hormizd isolated when crises inevitably arose. In 588, the fragile peace on the Oxus shattered. Baga Khagan, leader of the Turkic Khaganate, launched a massive invasion of the Sasanian East. The Turkic army, numbering in the tens of thousands, swept through the defences of Khorasan, capturing Balkh, Herat and Badghis. The road to the Iranian plateau lay open. Desperate and distrustful of his court generals, Hormizd IV appointed a commander from the house of Mihran, Bahram Chobin. Bahram was a military genius, a sparbed who hailed from Ray and claimed Arsasid descent, giving him a pedigree that rivaled the Sasanians themselves. The ensuing campaign is legendary in Persian military history. Bahram utilized the rugged terrain of the Hyrcanian rock to neutralize the Turks' numerical advantage. He employed innovative tactics, including the use of naphtha-filled containers fired from bows to terrify the Turkic cavalry horses. In a decisive engagement, Bahram targeted the Turkic leadership. Sources recount that he personally killed Baga Khagan with an arrow shot to the spine. The death of the Khagan caused the Turkic Confederation to fragment, turning a potential Sasanian collapse into a rout of the enemy. Bahram pushed across the Oxus, seizing the Turkic treasury and capturing the Khagan's son, Bermuda. He sent the spoils to Ctesiphon, but retained the loyalty of his troops, who now saw him as the savior of Iran. Jealous of Bahram's soaring popularity and fearful of a coup, the king sought to humble his general. Hormizd sent him a woman's dress and a spindle, a supreme insult in the martial culture of Sasanian Iran. The insult backfired. Bahram Chobin revolted, declaring Hormizd unfit to rule. This marked the first time a non-Sasanian noble had openly challenged the dynasty's right to the throne. As Bahram marched on Ctesiphon, the nobility in the capital, already terrorized by Hormizd's purges, staged a preemptive coup. Led by Vistam and Vindui, brothers-in-law of the king, they blinded and strangled Hormizd in 590 and placed his son Khosrow II on the throne. But Bahram rejected Khosrow's overtures, claiming the House of Sasan had lost its Quara, its divine glory. He defeated Khosrow's forces, forcing the young king to flee westward. In a shocking turn of events, the King of Kings sought refuge with his hereditary enemy, the Byzantine Emperor Maurice. Bahram Chobin entered Ctesiphon and crowned himself King Bahram VI, attempting to restore the Arsasid dynasty of the Parthians. Emperor Maurice granted Khosrow assistance, but it came at a steep price: the cession of strategic territories in Armenia and Mesopotamia. In 591, a combined Byzantine-Sasanian army marched against Bahram. At the Battle of Blarathon, Bahram was defeated. He fled to the Turks in Fergana, where he was welcomed as a hero, but was eventually assassinated by Sasanian agents. Khosrow II, known as Parviz the Victorious, presided over the empire's greatest territorial expansion and its most spectacular collapse. His reign was marked by opulence, cultural splendor, and deep-seated paranoia. To secure his throne, he executed his uncles Vistam and Vinduyi, alienating the powerful house of Ispabudin. In 602, the Sasanian-Byzantine peace was shattered. Emperor Maurice was murdered by the usurper Phocas. Khosrow II, seizing the perfect justification of revenge for his benefactor Maurice, declared war. What began as a punitive expedition transformed into a 26-year war of annihilation, the last great war of antiquity. The Sasanian war machine, led by the brilliant generals Shahrbaraz, Boar of the Empire, and Shahin, dismantled the Byzantine East piece by piece. In Mesopotamia and Armenia from 602 to 610, the border fortresses of Dara, Edessa, and Amida fell, securing the Sasanian flank. In 613, Shahrbaraz defeated the Byzantines near Antioch, opening the path to the Levant. A year later, Persian forces besieged Jerusalem, aided by Jewish rebels who had suffered under Byzantine persecution, and the city fell after a 19-day siege. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was burned, thousands of Christians were massacred or deported, and the True Cross, Christendom's holiest relic, was captured and taken to Ctesiphon. This was a psychological blow intended to signal the end of the Christian Empire. In 618, Shahrbaraz marched south, conquering Egypt, the granary of Constantinople. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the Achaemenid dream of ruling the Nile was realized. Pahlavi papyri from this period reveal a functioning Sasanian colonial administration in Alexandria, with Persian troops camped at Chalcedon. Visible from the walls of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire seemed doomed. But Phocas had been deposed, and the new emperor Heraclius initiated a desperate and unorthodox counter-offensive. Abandoning his capital, he sailed to the Black Sea and struck the Sasanian rear in the Caucasus in 622, forcing the Persians to fight on their own soil. Khosrow II coordinated a pincer attack with the Avar Khaganate. The Avars besieged Constantinople from the European side, while the Persians held the Asian shore. The plan failed because the Byzantine navy prevented the Persians from ferrying troops across the Bosphorus. The Avar assault was also repelled, and the siege collapsed. Heraclius tried a similar ploy, allying with the Western Turks. In 627, the Turks stormed the Caspian gates at Derbent, sacking Tbilisi and devastating Caucasian Albania. This forced Khosrow to divert troops to the north, weakening his defense against Heraclius. In December, Heraclius engaged the Sasanian general Hazard near Nineveh. In a dense fog, the Byzantine army destroyed the Sasanian force. Hazard was killed, and Heraclius marched on Ctesiphon, looting the royal palace at Dastagerd and recovering 300 Roman standards. Khosrow fled, but refused to make peace. The Sasanian nobility, their lands devastated and their sons dead, finally revolted. In February 628, Khosrow's son Shero seized the throne as Kavad II. Khosrow was imprisoned and put on trial for his crimes against the state, including parricide and ruining the empire with taxation. He was executed on February 28, 628. Kavad II immediately sued for peace, restoring all conquered territories and the True Cross to Heraclius. The war had ended, but the Sasanian state was mortally wounded. Peace brought no relief. A bubonic plague pandemic, a recurrence of the plague of Justinian, swept through the western provinces, likely carried by soldiers returning from Syria. Known as the Plague of Shiro, it killed the new king Kavad II after only months of rule. It is estimated that up to 1/2 of the population in the lower Mesopotamia perished. The death of the king unleashed a chaotic succession crisis. Between 628 and 632, more than 10 rulers claimed the throne, and the empire fractured into competing military-political factions. The Parsik, or Persian faction, was led by Piras Khosrow. They represented the nobility of Persis and supported the child king Ardashir III. The Pahlav, or Parthian faction, was led by Farrukh Hormizd from the house of Isbabudin, and later by his son Rostam Farrukhzad. They controlled the north, the regions of Azerbaijan and Khorasan, and the treasury. The crown became a pawn. The general Shahryar, fresh off his military struggles with the Eastern Romans, allied with the Parsec faction and marched on Ctesiphon with a small force, killed the child king Ardashir, and usurped the throne. He reigned for only 40 days before being assassinated by the Pahlav faction. The daughters of Khosrow II, Boran and Azarmedokht, reigned briefly, attempting to stabilize the state, but they too fell victim to the factional violence. By 632, the exhausted nobility crowned Yazdegerd III, a young grandson of Khosrow II, found hiding in Istakhr. He was a compromise candidate, a boy king presiding over a shattered confederacy of quarrelling warlords. The Turks, the Romans, and the Sasanians were all exhausted, and it was at this point that yet another rival emerged, this time from the south. These Arabs were not Christian or pagan like the Arabs who bordered the empire. Now unified under the banner of Islam, they had started a series of probing raids that revealed the weakness of the Sasanian state and soon turned into a war of conquest. Khosrow II had dismantled the Lakhmid buffer state during his reign, leaving the desert frontier dangerously exposed. In 634, at the Battle of the Bridge, the Sasanians achieved a major victory. Under Bahman Jadui, the Sasanian army used war elephants to terrify the Arab forces at the crossing of the Euphrates. The Arabs scattered, but Bahram could not pursue them due to a renewed outbreak of rebellion in Ctesiphon. The decisive engagement for the fate of Mesopotamia came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636. The Sasanian army was led by the Sparbed Rostam Farrukhzad, the most powerful man in the empire. The battle raged for 4 days. Day 1, the day of Armath, Sasanian elephants disrupted the Arab cavalry formations. Day 2, the day of Agwath, Arab reinforcements arrived from Syria, and the Persians were beaten back to a stalemate. Day 3, the day of Imash. The Arabs targeted the elephants, blinding them or cutting their trunks, causing them to stampede back through the Persian lines. Day 4, the day of Qadisiyah. A fierce sandstorm blew into the faces of the Sasanians. In the confusion, Rostam was killed, and with his death, the Sasanian army disintegrated. In the aftermath, the Arabs captured Ctesiphon, seizing the immense imperial treasury and the Derafsh Kaviani. Yazdegerd III fled to the Iranian plateau. In 642, Umar, the Rashidun Caliph, ordered a full-scale invasion to prevent a Sasanian counterattack. The armies met at Nahavand. The Sasanian force was a coalition of feudal levies from Khorasan, Azerbaijan and Fars, led by Piruz Khosrow. They outnumbered the Arabs, but were composed of disparate units with low morale. The Arabs, commanded by Al-Numan ibn Mukrin, employed a feigned retreat tactic, drawing the Persians out of their fortified positions. The Sasanian army was encircled and annihilated. This battle is known in Islamic historiography as the Fath al-Futuh, the victory of victories. The empire, heir to the 1,000-year-old Persian tradition, lost Iran to the new order, but they quietly shaped that new order from within.